Some men don't just cross the line between human and monster, they erase it entirely, rewriting the rules of evil with their own hands. What happens when the predator hiding in plain sight realizes no one is watching? The answer is written in blood, terror, and the shattered lives of the innocent. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of Jarvis Caddo. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Tonight, we're tracking a shadow that wore a human face. A man who turned the streets of New York into his personal hunting ground while the world slept, unaware that a demon walked among them. But this isn't just another story about evil. This is about the night evil miscalculated, the moment the hunter became the hunted, and the terrifying realization that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with silence, rage, and a mother's scream that echoed through the darkness. Welcome to the nightmare of Jarvis Caddo, the man who proved that monsters don't hide under beds. They answer your door. March 1941. New York City hummed with the electric tension of a world on the brink of war, its streets crowded with dreams, desperation, and danger. The city's heartbeat pulsed through every borough, but in Harlem, in the Bronx, in the forgotten corners where working families struggled to survive, another rhythm played, softer, darker, laced with fear that no one could name yet. Jarvis Roosevelt Caddo wasn't supposed to be anyone's nightmare. Born in 1909 in South Carolina, he drifted north like thousands of other black men seeking opportunity in the industrial cities of the North. He found work as a handyman, a maintenance man, someone who fixed things, someone people trusted with their keys, their homes, their safety. He had an easy smile, polite manners, and the kind of forgettable face that never raised alarms. Neighbors would nod at him. Landlords hired him. Women opened their doors when he knocked. That was his camouflage. Because behind those unremarkable eyes lived something ancient and ravenous, something that studied people the way a spider studies the trembling of its web. Caddo didn't just see women. He cataloged them, memorized their routines, noted when they were alone, tracked when husbands left for work, when children went to school. He transformed the mundane architecture of daily life into a blueprint for horror. His first confirmed victim was Rose Blumenstein, though investigators would later suspect he'd been practicing his craft long before her name entered the record books. Rose was a young mother, barely into her 20s, living in the Bronx with her infant daughter. On March 8, 1941, she made the fatal mistake of answering her door when Jarvis Caddo knocked, claiming he needed to check the building's plumbing. What happened next in that apartment would establish a pattern so methodical, so precisely brutal, that when detectives finally pieced together Caddo's crimes, they realized they weren't hunting an impulsive killer. They were hunting a craftsman who'd perfected his terrible art. Rose fought. The evidence would later show that she fought with every ounce of strength a young mother protecting her child could summon. But Caddo had learned something crucial about violence that most people never understand. Overwhelming force, applied without hesitation, without mercy, without that human pause that allows victims to react, wins every time. He strangled her with his bare hands, watching the light fade from her eyes while her baby cried in the next room. Then he did something that would become his signature, the detail that would eventually connect seemingly random murders across New York. He arranged her body with grotesque precision, positioning her carefully, almost ritualistically, before ransacking the apartment to make it look like a robbery. But it was never about robbery. The few dollars he took were an afterthought, a prop in a performance where the real reward was the power, the control, the godlike sensation of holding another person's final breath in his hands. The baby lived. That detail matters because it reveals something crucial about Caddo's psychology. He wasn't killing out of panic or necessity. He was killing because he wanted to, because something in him required it, demanded it, hungered for it with an appetite that grew stronger with each murder. New York in the 1940s was a city of millions, a churning chaos where people disappeared into the machinery of urban life and sometimes simply vanished. Communication between police precincts was rudimentary. Different boroughs operated like separate cities. A murder in Harlem might never be connected to a murder in the Bronx, especially when the victims were poor, especially when they were women, especially when they were black. Cato understood this instinctively. He moved between neighborhoods like a shark cruising between reefs, never hunting too close to home, never establishing a pattern obvious enough to trigger alarm. After Rose Blumenstein, he waited. Patience was part of his ritual, the way a predator allows the herd to settle before selecting the next target. 3 weeks later, on March 27th, Amelia Jackson opened her door in Harlem to find a polite maintenance man who said he needed to check the radiators. Amelia was a domestic worker, a woman who cleaned wealthy people's homes to support her own family. She'd lived through enough to be cautious, but caution has limits when someone is wearing work clothes, carrying tools, speaking softly, projecting the kind of humble competence that signals trustworthiness. She died in her living room, strangled with such force that the autopsy would reveal crushed cartilage in her throat. Once again, Cato staged the scene, took a few personal items, and vanished back into the city's anonymous crowds. Once again, a life extinguished, a family shattered, a case that went cold almost immediately because there were no witnesses, no forensic science capable of tracking him, nothing but the aftermath of violence and a predator who was learning with each kill exactly how invisible he could become. Then came Mrs. Evelyn Anderson, a 42-year-old widow living alone in the Bronx. Then Mrs. Florence Brown, a schoolteacher whose students would never understand why she didn't come to class that Monday morning in April. The names piled up like a secret ledger written in blood. Josephine Ross, Ella Mae Holmes, Catherine Perry. Each one a woman living her life, each one targeted not randomly but with terrible purpose. Each one proof that Jarvis Cato had discovered something most people live their entire lives without understanding. How easy it is to kill when you've abandoned your humanity entirely. By the spring of 1941, even the fragmented, overworked police departments of New York began noticing similarities. Different detectives in different precincts started comparing notes, sharing the details that didn't fit the narrative of random robberies. The positioning of bodies, the specific method of strangulation, the fact that very little was actually stolen, the way the crime scenes felt staged, performed, theatrical. But Jarvis Cato had gotten sloppy in one crucial way. He'd started to believe his own myth of invincibility. Success is a dangerous drug for serial killers because it erodes the caution that keeps them hidden. Each successful murder whispered to him that he was smarter than everyone else, that he'd discovered a secret formula, that he could continue forever. He was wrong. What Cato didn't understand was that his invisibility wasn't genius, it was circumstance. He was a black man killing primarily black women in poor neighborhoods during an era when those murders didn't command the resources, attention, or urgency that other crimes received. His camouflage wasn't skill, it was systemic indifference. But even systemic indifference has limits when bodies keep appearing, when the pattern becomes undeniable, when enough detectives with enough conscience start demanding answers. Detective work in 1941 was brutal, unglamorous labor, knocking on doors, interviewing hundreds of people, building timelines by hand, connecting fragments of information that seemed meaningless until suddenly they weren't. Several detectives across multiple precincts began constructing what would now be called a profile, though they didn't have that language yet. They knew they were hunting someone who could access apartments easily, someone who worked in maintenance or had a similar occupation, someone who could appear unthreatening to women alone in their homes. They started checking employment records, interviewing building superintendents, compiling lists of maintenance workers who'd had access to the various buildings where murders occurred. It was exhaustive, mind-numbing work that led nowhere more often than somewhere. But persistence has its own mathematics. Enough hours, enough questions, enough cross-referencing of information eventually produces patterns. And one name kept appearing with suspicious frequency in the margins of multiple investigations. Jarvis Cato, handyman, maintenance worker, the quiet man with tools who could fix anything broken, except his own diseased soul. While New York detectives were slowly, agonizingly connecting the dots, Jarvis Caddo made a decision that revealed both his cunning and his compulsion. He left New York, not because he felt pressure, he was still largely invisible to law enforcement, but because his appetite demanded fresh hunting grounds, new territories where his face wouldn't be familiar, where his pattern wouldn't be anticipated. He relocated to Washington, D.C., arriving in the nation's capital in the summer of 1941 with the same unremarkable efficiency that characterized everything about him. He found work quickly, his experience and references from New York landlords opening doors to apartment buildings and boarding houses throughout the city. He was reliable, quiet, respectful, the kind of employee property managers appreciated because he didn't cause problems. He caused nightmares instead. Washington in 1941 was a city transformed by the approach of war. The government was expanding rapidly, pulling workers from across the country to staff the growing military and civilian bureaucracy. Housing was tight. People lived in crowded boarding houses, small apartments, rooms rented by the week. Privacy was a luxury. Security was an afterthought. For a predator like Caddo, it was paradise. His first known victim in Washington was Evelyn Smith, a 38-year-old seamstress who lived alone in a boarding house on U Street. She was found on July 15th, strangled in her locked room, her few possessions scattered as though someone had searched for valuables. The positioning of her body, that careful, ritualistic arrangement, was present, but the Metropolitan Police Department of D.C. had no reason to connect a murder in their city to murders in New York. This was before the FBI had established centralized crime databases, before computers could cross-reference patterns across jurisdictions. Caddo had found a new ecosystem where his particular form of evil could flourish unchecked. Understanding Jarvis Caddo requires understanding his method, the precise mechanics of how he transformed from unremarkable handyman into the executioner of women's lives. He didn't kill impulsively. Every murder was preceded by reconnaissance, by careful observation, by the patient work of identifying vulnerable targets and creating opportunities. He watched women come and go from their apartments, noting their schedules. He memorized which ones lived alone, which ones had irregular hours, which ones might not be missed immediately if they didn't show up for work. He used his legitimate access to buildings to map escape routes, to identify apartments with poor sightlines, to understand the rhythms of when neighbors were home and when they weren't. When he selected a target, he would manufacture a reason to knock on her door. A supposed plumbing issue, a building inspection, a package that needed signing for. His demeanor was crucial. Never aggressive, never pushy, always apologetic for the interruption, always professional. Women opened their doors because refusing seemed paranoid, seemed rude, seemed like an overreaction to a simple maintenance request. The moment he was inside, everything changed. The transformation from polite workman to lethal predator happened in seconds. He would close the door, sometimes lock it, and before his victim could fully process the shift in his demeanor, he would attack with overwhelming violence. His preferred method was manual strangulation, not with a ligature but with his bare hands, because that gave him the control he craved, the intimate connection to the moment of death, the ability to watch his victim's face as consciousness faded. The strangulation wasn't quick. Caddo took his time, sometimes releasing pressure to let his victims regain partial consciousness before strangling them again, extending their terror, feeding on their desperation. This wasn't murder as a means to an end. This was murder as the end itself, the whole point, the thing his broken psychology required with addictive intensity. After death, he would arrange the bodies, though investigators never fully understood the significance of his staging. Was it aesthetic? Ritualistic? A signature meant to communicate something to whoever found them? Caddo never explained, and perhaps he couldn't have even if he'd wanted to. Some compulsions exist below the level of conscious reasoning, in the primitive depths of the brain where instinct and pathology merge into behaviors that feel necessary without being understandable. Through the late summer and fall of 1941, Washington's murder rate for women living alone began climbing. Each case seemed isolated, different neighborhoods, different victim profiles, different circumstances, but they shared commonalities that a more connected law enforcement system might have noticed earlier. Middle-aged women living alone, killed in their locked apartments, strangled, staged crime scenes suggesting robbery but with minimal actual theft. Rose Abramovitz, a 51-year-old clerk, was found in her apartment on August 3rd. Her neck bore the distinctive bruising pattern of manual strangulation, the killer's thumbs having pressed into her windpipe with crushing force, while his fingers wrapped around to the back of her skull. The medical examiner noted the brutality required to inflict such damage. This wasn't defensive violence or a fight gone wrong. This was execution. 3 weeks later, Anna Purcell died the same way in an apartment 6 blocks away. Then Maddie Stewart. Then Gladys Taylor, whose daughter found her arranged carefully on her bed, positioned as though sleeping except for the ligature marks and the expression of terror frozen on her face. The Metropolitan Police began investigating more aggressively, but they were hampered by the same limitations that had protected Caddo in New York. Lack of forensic technology, poor interjurisdictional communication, and the reality that most of their investigative resources were being diverted to wartime security concerns. Finding a domestic murderer felt almost trivial compared to the global conflagration consuming Europe and threatening America. But some detectives couldn't let it go. There's a particular kind of obsession that grips good detectives when they're hunting a serial killer, a recognition that they're in a race against time because the one certainty is that the killing will continue until the killer is stopped. Detective James Davis of the Metropolitan Police Homicide Division became that obsessed investigator for the Washington murders. Davis started mapping the killings, creating timelines, interviewing witnesses in buildings where victims had lived. He compiled descriptions of men seen entering or leaving the buildings around the times of the murders. Most leads went nowhere. In crowded boarding houses, strange men were always coming and going, and nobody paid much attention to a workman carrying tools. But patterns emerged. Several witnesses mentioned seeing a black maintenance worker, average height, unremarkable appearance, carrying a toolbox, in or near the buildings where murders occurred. It wasn't much, but it was something. Davis began checking employment records, tracking down maintenance workers, conducting interviews. Jarvis Caddo's name appeared on several lists. He'd done work in at least 3 buildings where murders had occurred, though not necessarily on the days of the killings. It was circumstantial, weak, the kind of lead that could easily be a coincidence. But Davis added the name to his list of people to interview, unaware that he'd just identified one of the most prolific serial killers operating in America. By the beginning of 1942, Caddo had killed at least 10 women in Washington alone, and the number could have been higher. There were unsolved murders that fit his pattern but couldn't be definitively connected. His success had made him bold. He was hunting more frequently, taking fewer precautions, operating with the confidence of someone who believed he'd perfected an invisible art. That confidence would prove fatal. On March 7, 1942, Caddo targeted a 46-year-old woman named Elizabeth Davis, no relation to the detective hunting him, who lived in a small apartment in the Shaw neighborhood. Everything proceeded according to his usual method. The knock on the door, the excuse about checking building systems, the moment of entry, the attack. But Elizabeth Davis was tougher than most of his victims. She fought back with savage desperation, scratching his face deeply enough to draw blood, screaming loud enough that neighbors heard. Caddo, panicking for one of the few times in his murderous career, fled before ensuring she was dead. She survived. For 3 days, Elizabeth Davis lay in her apartment, drifting in and out of consciousness, too injured to reach the door or call for help. When neighbors finally broke in after not seeing her for days, they found her barely alive, her throat bearing the marks of attempted strangulation, her apartment destroyed from the struggle. At the hospital, once she could speak, she described her attacker. A black maintenance man of medium height, with distinctive scars and marks on his hands from years of manual labor, who'd claimed he needed to check the radiators. She'd seen him before in the building, doing repair work, which was why she'd opened the door. Detective Davis now had his first eyewitness, his first survivor, his first real break in the case. He pulled employment records for every maintenance worker who'd had access to that building. Jarvis Caddo's name was there, along with an address where he was currently living. The trap was closing, though Caddo didn't know it yet. He'd broken his pattern by leaving a survivor, violated his own rules, allowed his compulsion to override his caution. In that violation lay his undoing. March 11th, 1942. Detective James Davis stood outside a shabby boarding house in Northeast Washington, accompanied by two uniformed officers. They were there to question Jarvis Caddo about the attack on Elizabeth Davis and, depending on how that conversation went, potentially about a series of murders that had terrorized the city for months. Davis felt the particular electricity that comes when a long investigation finally crystallizes into action. He'd spent months chasing shadows, building timelines, connecting fragments of evidence that individually meant nothing but together suggested something monstrous. Now he had a survivor's description, employment records that placed Caddo at multiple crime scenes, and witnesses who'd seen a man matching his description in the vicinity of several murders. It wasn't airtight. A good defense attorney could punch holes in every piece of evidence. But it was enough to bring Caddo in, enough to apply pressure, enough to see what happened when you shined light into the dark places where predators hide. They climbed the stairs to Caddo's third-floor room. The building smelled of cooking grease, mildew, and the particular despair of transient living. Davis knocked. Once, twice. Movement inside, footsteps approaching the door. When Jarvis Caddo opened that door and saw detectives instead of whoever he'd expected, something shifted in his expression. A microscopic change that Davis, who'd been doing this work for 20 years, recognized immediately. It was the look of a man recalculating his options, running through scenarios, trying to decide whether to run, fight, or pretend innocence. "Jarvis Caddo?" Davis asked, though he already knew. "Yes, sir." Polite, respectful, concerned, the mask firmly in place. "We need you to come with us to answer some questions about an incident that occurred in a building where you were working last week." "What kind of incident?" Still playing the role of the concerned, innocent citizen. "A woman was attacked. Badly. She gave us a description of her attacker. She says it was a maintenance man who'd been working in her building. Your name came up in our investigation." Something flickered behind Caddo's eyes. For just a moment, Davis saw past the mask to the thing underneath. Calculating, predatory, trying to determine how much they knew, how much they could prove, whether cooperation or resistance offered better odds of escape. "I think there's been some mistake," Caddo said. "I do work in lots of buildings, but I never hurt nobody. I'm a Christian man. The invocation of Christianity, of respectability, of moral character." It was textbook, the exact defense that guilty men always deployed, as though proclaiming virtue could erase the stains on their souls. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station to clear this up," Davis said, not making it a question. Caddo had no choice. He grabbed his coat and followed them down the stairs, neighbors watching from cracked doors as detectives led one of their own away, not yet understanding that they'd been living beside a monster. The interrogation room of the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division was a deliberately uncomfortable space. Harsh lighting, bare walls, a wooden table, and chairs that seemed designed to prevent relaxation. Davis sat across from Caddo, studying him, trying to penetrate the facade of calm confusion that Caddo maintained. They started with Elizabeth Davis's attack, the one case where they had a survivor, a witness, direct testimony. Davis laid out the facts. Elizabeth identified Caddo as her attacker. His employment records placed him in her building. He had access and opportunity. Caddo denied everything. He'd been in the building doing repairs, yes, but he'd never been in Elizabeth Davis's apartment. Never spoke to her, certainly never attacked her. She must be confused, traumatized, mistaken about who hurt her. These things happen. Memory is unreliable. It was a reasonable defense, the kind that might work if they were only talking about one crime. But Davis wasn't playing that game. He began introducing other cases, other murdered women, other buildings where Caddo had worked, other suspicious coincidences that individually seemed weak but collectively painted a portrait of a man who was always nearby when death came calling. Caddo's demeanor began shifting. The polite confusion gave way to irritation, then to a kind of cold assessment. He stopped answering questions, asked for a lawyer, shut down communication. Davis knew that meant he'd touched something real, pushed close enough to the truth that Cato felt threatened. But they didn't have enough to hold him indefinitely. Not yet. The evidence was circumstantial. Elizabeth Davis's identification was strong, but a defense attorney could argue mistaken identity, trauma-induced confusion, the unreliability of cross-racial identification. Without physical evidence, without confessions, without the forensic technology that wouldn't exist for decades, building a murder case was grinding, frustrating work. What changed everything was a decision by the Metropolitan Police to take Cato's fingerprints and share them with other jurisdictions, including the New York Police Department. This was unusual for the time. Interjurisdictional cooperation was rare, time-consuming, bureaucratically complex. But the pattern of murdered women, the distinctive method of killing, the maintenance worker profile, it all suggested the possibility that they were dealing with a killer who'd operated in multiple cities. In New York, Detective Frank Sullivan had been working the unsolved strangulation murders from 1941, the string of dead women that had haunted his precincts for over a year. When Cato's fingerprints and description arrived from Washington, Sullivan felt the hair on his neck stand up. He pulled the case files, started cross-referencing. Jarvis Cato had lived in New York. He'd worked as a handyman in multiple buildings throughout Harlem and the Bronx. His employment history overlapped with several of the murders. And his method, manual strangulation, staging of crime scenes, targeting of women living alone, matched the New York cases perfectly. Sullivan called Washington. Then he got on a train, bringing his case files, ready to compare notes, build a comprehensive picture of a killer who'd been operating across multiple jurisdictions for at least 2 years. When Sullivan and Davis sat down together, spreading out photographs, autopsy reports, timeline documents across a conference table, the scope of Jarvis Cato's killing spree became horrifyingly clear. They could definitively connect him to at least 8 murders in New York and 10 in Washington, with several more unsolved cases that fit his pattern but couldn't be proven beyond doubt. They were hunting one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a man who'd murdered potentially 24 women while maintaining the facade of a polite, reliable working man. With the connection between the New York and Washington murders established, both police departments redoubled their efforts. They needed physical evidence, needed something beyond circumstantial connections and pattern recognition. They searched Cato's room thoroughly, tearing apart the shabby space where he'd been living. What they found was illuminating and disturbing. Personal items belonging to victims. Jewelry, small valuables, trinkets that meant nothing to Cato but had been precious to the women he'd murdered. He'd kept trophies, souvenirs, physical reminders of his crimes. It was common among serial killers, though law enforcement hadn't fully developed that understanding yet. The items themselves weren't definitive proof of murder, but they connected Cato directly to women who died in suspicious circumstances. More importantly, they found scratches on Cato's face and hands, defensive wounds consistent with Elizabeth Davis's account of fighting off her attacker. The medical evidence supported her testimony. Between the physical evidence, the survivor's identification, and the growing mountain of circumstantial connections to multiple murders, prosecutors felt confident they could make a case. Cato was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Rose Abramovitz in Washington and the attempted murder of Elizabeth Davis. The strategy was deliberate. Start with the cases they could prove most easily, secure convictions, then expand to include the other murders. The news hit the papers like an explosion. Handyman arrested in series of strangulation murders. The headlines screamed. Suddenly, the quiet man who'd fixed radiators and repaired plumbing was revealed as a predator who'd hunted women across 2 major American cities. Neighbors who'd lived beside him, landlords who'd employed him, expressed shock, disbelief, the standard reactions of people confronting the banality of evil. But some people weren't surprised. Some of the women in the buildings where Cato had worked came forward with stories of uncomfortable encounters, of feeling watched, of Cato appearing in places he shouldn't have been, of instincts that warned them something was wrong. They dismissed their concerns as paranoia, as overreaction, as the price of living while female in a world where men had access and women were supposed to be gracious about it. Their instincts had been correct. Jarvis Cato was exactly what they'd feared, exactly the kind of monster their intuition had detected beneath his mask of normalcy. The trial of Jarvis Roosevelt Caddo began in the summer of 1942 in a Washington, D.C. courtroom packed with journalists, curious citizens, and family members of the victims who'd waited months for this moment. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Edward M. Curran, faced the challenge of building a case strong enough to justify capital punishment in an era when forensic evidence was limited and circumstantial connections were often insufficient for conviction. Their strategy was methodical. Start with Elizabeth Davis, the survivor, whose testimony would be the emotional and factual cornerstone of the case. Build from there to the pattern of murders, the physical evidence, the employment records that placed Caddo at scene after scene where death had occurred. Elizabeth Davis took the stand on the trial's second day. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as she described answering her door to a man she'd seen before in her building, a maintenance worker she had no reason to fear. She recounted the sudden transformation from polite workman to violent attacker, the feeling of his hands crushing her throat, the terror of knowing she was dying, the desperate fight that barely saved her life. She pointed directly at Caddo, identifying him without hesitation, her voice steady despite the obvious trauma of reliving the attack. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who tried to kill me." The defense attorney, a public defender named Richard Hayes who'd drawn the unenviable task of representing Caddo, tried to undermine her testimony. He questioned her memory, suggested the trauma had confused her, raised the specter of mistaken identification. But Elizabeth Davis didn't waver. She'd looked into her attacker's eyes as he strangled her, had studied his face in those terrible moments when she thought she was dying. She knew exactly who he was. The prosecution then began methodically building the larger picture, calling witnesses who'd seen Caddo in buildings where murders occurred, presenting employment records, introducing items found in Caddo's room that belonged to murder victims. One by one, they constructed the portrait of a serial killer who'd used his occupation as cover for a murder spree that had terrorized 2 cities. On the trial's 5th day, something unexpected happened. Jarvis Caddo, who'd maintained his innocence throughout the investigation and the early days of the trial, asked to speak with prosecutors. In a private meeting with U.S. Attorney Curran, Caddo began talking. What emerged over the next several hours was a confession that stretched across years and cities, a catalog of murders delivered in a monotone voice devoid of emotion or remorse. Caddo admitted to strangling Rose Blumenstein in New York, to killing Amelia Jackson and Evelyn Anderson and all the other New York victims. He confessed to the Washington murders, describing each one with clinical precision. How he'd selected his victims, gained entry to their homes, killed them, arranged their bodies. Why confess now? Psychologists would later speculate that Caddo, facing overwhelming evidence and certain conviction, chose confession as a final assertion of control, a way to dictate the narrative rather than having it dictated to him. Serial killers often exhibit narcissistic tendencies, needing recognition for their work, seeking acknowledgement of their intelligence and skill, even as they're being held accountable. Caddo's confession was strategic in another way. By admitting to the murders, he could potentially avoid a drawn-out trial for each individual case, limiting his exposure to multiple death sentences, seeking whatever small advantage remained to him. It was a calculated move by a calculating man who'd spent years calculating how to kill without being caught. The confession was damning and comprehensive, filling in gaps that investigators hadn't been able to bridge, solving murders that had gone cold, bringing closure to families who'd waited years for answers. Caddo admitted to at least 9 murders in New York and 8 in Washington, with hints at others he'd committed before beginning his documented killing spree. When asked why he'd done it, Caddo had no satisfactory answer. He claimed he didn't know, that something came over him, that he couldn't control himself. It was the standard excuse of violent men throughout history, the abdication of responsibility, the claim that some external force had controlled their actions, that they were victims of their own impulses. The prosecution rejected this entirely. Caddo's methodical planning, his careful selection of victims, his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy between murders, all of it demonstrated clear consciousness of his actions, deliberate choice, full moral and legal culpability. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman announced the verdict: guilty on all counts of murder. Guilty of the attempted murder of Elizabeth Davis. Guilty of being exactly what the evidence had shown him to be, a serial killer who'd preyed on vulnerable women for years. The sentencing phase was equally swift. Judge Balatha J. Laws, presiding over the case, heard victim impact statements from family members of the deceased. Daughters who'd lost mothers. Sisters who'd lost sisters. Each one describing the void left by Cato's actions, the ripple effects of violence that extended far beyond the immediate victims. When it was time to pronounce sentence, Judge Laws addressed Cato directly. You have committed crimes so heinous, so completely devoid of human decency, that they shock the conscience of this community. You hunted women like prey, violated the trust they placed in you, ended their lives without mercy or remorse. This court can find no reason why society should permit you to continue existing. The sentence was death by electrocution, to be carried out at the District of Columbia's execution facility. Cato showed no reaction, maintaining the emotional flatness that had characterized him throughout the trial. If he felt fear or regret, he hid it behind the same mask he'd worn while killing. Appeals delayed the execution for nearly a year, but every appeal was denied. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession comprehensive, the legal process sound. On January 15, 1943, Jarvis Roosevelt Cato was escorted to the execution chamber at the district jail. Witnesses to the execution later reported that Cato maintained his composure until the very end, walking to the electric chair without resistance, sitting as guards strapped him in, remaining silent when asked if he had any final words. The mask held even at the threshold of death. At 12:07 a.m., the first jolt of electricity surged through Cato's body. He died within minutes, the monster finally destroyed. The killing spree definitively ended. There was no drama, no last-minute confession of additional crimes, no explanation that could help the living understand how someone becomes capable of such sustained, methodical evil. His body was claimed by distant relatives and buried in an unmarked grave. The state of New York and the District of Columbia closed multiple murder investigations, finally able to tell families that the killer had been caught, tried, and executed. Justice had been served, though the word felt hollow to those who'd lost loved ones. The Jarvis Cato case left scars on American law enforcement that influenced police procedures for decades. The difficulty of connecting murders across jurisdictions led to early calls for better information sharing between police departments, eventually contributing to the creation of the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting System and, much later, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, that tracks serial offenders across state lines. The case also highlighted vulnerabilities that women faced in 1940s America: living alone, working service jobs, answering doors to maintenance workers because refusing seemed rude or paranoid. Cato had exploited every social convention that taught women to be polite, accommodating, trusting. His crimes were enabled by a society that valued women's agreeableness over their safety. In the decades since, criminologists and psychologists have studied Cato's case as an example of an organized serial killer who used occupational access to facilitate his crimes. He fits the profile of what would later be termed a power/control killer, someone motivated not by sexual gratification primarily, but by the sense of dominance and control achieved through taking another person's life. What remains most disturbing about Jarvis Cato is how ordinary he was. He wasn't a raving lunatic, wasn't visibly marked by madness, didn't advertise his dangerousness. He was quiet, competent, forgettable. Exactly the kind of person we pass every day without suspicion, without fear, without recognition that monsters don't announce themselves. The women he killed were equally ordinary. Working women, mothers, sisters, friends, people trying to survive in difficult times, making the same mundane decisions we all make about who to trust, when to be cautious, how to balance safety with the demands of daily life. They died because they made reasonable choices that, through tragic chance, put them in proximity to a predator. In the rush to focus on the killer, to analyze his methods, understand his psychology, trace his crimes, There's a danger of forgetting the people who mattered most, the victims whose lives were stolen, whose potential remained unrealized, whose families carried grief for generations. Rose Blumenstein never saw her daughter grow up. Amelia Jackson never finished the quilt she'd been sewing. Evelyn Anderson never took the trip she'd been saving for. Each of the women Caddo killed had dreams, plans, people who loved them, futures that were erased in moments of violence. They deserve to be remembered not as victims but as people, not as statistics in a serial killer's tally, but as individuals who lived, loved, struggled, hoped. Their deaths matter not because of who killed them, but because of who they were. The Jarvis Caddo case reminds us that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, that monsters walk among us indistinguishably from everyone else, that the capacity for violence exists closer than we want to believe. But it also reminds us of the importance of listening to women's fears, of taking seriously the instincts that warn us when something feels wrong, of creating systems and communities that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. Justice came for Jarvis Caddo, but it came too late for the women whose lives he ended. Their stories, their losses, their stolen futures remain the true tragedy of this case, the reason why we must never forget, never stop working to prevent such horrors, never accept that predators are simply an inevitable part of human existence. They were people, they mattered, they still matter, and that is the only conclusion that honors their memory. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The William Christensen Case. A father's love can build kingdoms or bury bodies where no one thinks to look. Some men wear their madness like a second skin, so perfectly fitted that even those who love them never see the seams. Tonight, we're stepping into the life of a man who convinced an entire community he was their neighbor, their friend, their protector, while secretly, methodically, he was becoming something else entirely. William Dean Christensen didn't just cross the line between sanity and monstrosity. He erased it. And when the truth finally clawed its way to the surface, it brought with it a darkness so complete, so suffocating, that an entire town would never sleep soundly again. William Dean Christensen understood something most people never grasp, that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warning. It arrives wearing khakis and a smile, coaches Little League. It waves from driveways and attends parent-teacher conferences. It becomes so ordinary, so unremarkable, that when the screaming finally starts, no one believes their own ears. The Christensen household sat on a tree-lined street where children rode bicycles until streetlights flickered on, where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and complained about property taxes. William lived there with his family, a man who seemed to embody suburban stability. He worked steadily, maintained his lawn with almost obsessive precision, and spoke in measured tones that suggested thoughtfulness rather than calculation. But behind the trimmed hedges and the freshly painted shutters, something was rotting from the inside out. Those who knew William described him as unremarkable, almost aggressively average. He had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, the sort of demeanor that made people's eyes slide past him without registering any particular impression. This wasn't accidental. William had spent years cultivating this persona, polishing it until it gleamed with manufactured authenticity. Every gesture, every carefully modulated response, every expression of concern or interest, all of it was performance, an elaborate costume worn by something that had long ago stopped being entirely human. The family structure appeared solid from the outside. There were routines, schedules, the ordinary rhythms of domestic life. But routines can be cages. Schedules can be tools of control. And within those walls, William was conducting experiments in power, testing the boundaries of how much fear a human heart could hold before it simply stopped beating from exhaustion. His wife noticed things first. The way his eyes would go flat and distant when he thought no one was watching, like windows looking into an abandoned house. The sudden shifts in temperature when he entered a room, as if he brought some invisible chill with him. The way their children had learned to move through the house like ghosts, making themselves small and silent, instinctively understanding that drawing attention meant inviting danger. But she did what so many do. She explained it away, rationalized it, convinced herself that the growing dread in her stomach was paranoia rather than prophecy. William's control over the household was absolute, but it was the kind of control that operated through psychological terrorism rather than obvious violence. He had learned early that the threat of harm was often more effective than harm itself. A look could communicate volumes. A silence could stretch until it became unbearable. He used isolation as a weapon, systematically cutting his family off from support systems, from friends and extended family who might notice the slowly tightening noose of his dominance. In public, he was the model citizen. He volunteered for community events, always ready with a helpful hand or a sympathetic ear. People trusted him because he seemed so harmless, so invested in the well-being of others. They couldn't see what his family saw. The way his helpfulness was just another form of surveillance, a way to monitor who might become a problem, who might need to be neutralized before they could interfere with his carefully constructed world. The psychological abuse was methodical, almost scientific in its application. William understood that breaking someone's spirit required patience and precision. He would build them up only to tear them down, create moments of apparent warmth only to withdraw them suddenly, leaving his victims constantly off balance, never knowing which version of him would appear next. This instability was intentional. It kept them dependent, kept them hoping that if they could just figure out the right combination of behaviors, they could make the good William stay and keep the monster at bay. But the monster was always there, barely contained beneath the surface. His family could sense it, that coiled tension that suggested violence waiting for permission to emerge. They learned to read the weather patterns of his moods, developed elaborate strategies to avoid triggering whatever darkness lived inside him. Dinner conversations became minefields. Simple questions required calculations about the safest possible answer. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion that everyone knew was coming but no one could predict. William's need for control extended beyond emotional and psychological manipulation. He monitored everything: phone calls, mail, movements, conversations. The family existed in a panopticon of his creation, always watched, always judged, always found wanting. Privacy became a concept from another life, something they dimly remembered but could no longer access. Even their thoughts felt exposed, as if his surveillance had become so complete it had invaded their interior lives. Friends and neighbors who occasionally glimpsed something off-kilter quickly dismissed their concerns. William was too quick with explanations, too reasonable in his responses. He had answers for everything, and those answers always made just enough sense to quiet suspicions. His wife seemed nervous. She'd always been high-strung. The children seemed withdrawn. Kids these days always on their devices. That bruise? A clumsy accident, you know how it is. Each explanation was delivered with just the right mixture of concern and dismissiveness, carefully calibrated to end the conversation before it could go anywhere dangerous. The community's willingness to accept these explanations wasn't just about William's skill at deception. It was about their own psychological need to believe that monsters don't live among us, that evil announces itself clearly and can be easily identified and avoided. To acknowledge William's true nature would have required them to admit that they had been fooled, that their judgment was fallible, that danger could be lurking behind any smiling face. It was easier to accept the comfortable lie than to confront the uncomfortable truth. As months turned into years, the pressure inside the Christensen household built like steam in a sealed container. William's control became more rigid, his demands more impossible to meet, his punishments more severe. His family was being slowly crushed under the weight of his pathology, their personalities eroding, their sense of self dissolving. They were being transformed into extensions of his will, puppets dancing to strings only they could feel. But pressure, when it builds long enough, eventually finds a release. And when it did, when the carefully maintained facade finally cracked and the truth came spilling out, it would reveal something so disturbing, so comprehensively evil, that an entire community would be forced to reckon with their own blindness. They would have to confront the fact that they had lived next door to darkness and called it neighborly. They had shared space with a predator and called it community. And that realization would haunt them far longer than any nightmare. The question that would come to torment everyone who knew William was simple but impossible to answer. How many signs did we miss? How many silent screams did we fail to hear? How many times did we choose comfort over courage? And what did that choice cost? Every monster makes mistakes. The truly dangerous ones simply make fewer of them, and make them later, after they've already inflicted irreparable damage. William Dean Christensen's mistake wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was small, almost insignificant. A tiny crack in the dam he'd built to hold back the flood of evidence that could destroy him. But tiny cracks have a way of widening, and once the water starts flowing, nothing can stop it. The beginning of William's downfall came from an unexpected source. A teacher who actually paid attention. Most people see what they expect to see, their observations filtered through assumptions and social conventions. But this teacher, whose name would later be spoken with gratitude and regret in equal measure, had trained herself to notice the things others overlooked. She saw the way one of the Christensen children flinched at sudden movements. She noticed how homework assignments about my family were completed with mechanical precision but emotional emptiness, as if the child was describing strangers rather than loved ones. At first, she told herself she was reading too much into normal childhood behavior. Kids could be moody, withdrawn, secretive. But the pattern persisted, and patterns have meaning. There was something about the way this child existed in the world, simultaneously desperate for attention and terrified of receiving it, that suggested a life lived in constant fear. The teacher began documenting her observations, building a case without fully understanding what she was building it toward. Meanwhile, inside the Christensen home, the tension had reached critical mass. William's control had become so total, so suffocating, that it had started generating its own resistance. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it breeds desperation in its victims, and desperation makes people reckless. One family member, worn down by years of psychological torture, began to push back in small ways. A look held too long, a response that wasn't quite submissive enough. A moment of defiance that lasted only seconds but represented a seismic shift in the household power dynamics. William felt this shift like a tremor in the earth beneath his feet. His entire identity was built on control, and any threat to that control was existential. He responded the way cornered predators always do, with escalating violence designed to reassert dominance and crush any hint of rebellion. But violence leaves marks, and marks raise questions, and questions lead to investigations that even the most careful manipulator can't always control. The teacher made a phone call. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet conversation with a social worker, expressing concern about a student who seemed troubled. She was careful, professional, not wanting to make accusations she couldn't support. But she had seen enough, documented enough, felt enough unease that she couldn't remain silent. That phone call set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose everything William had worked so hard to conceal. The initial investigation was routine, almost perfunctory. A social worker visited the Christensen home, announced and scheduled, giving William plenty of time to prepare. And prepare he did, orchestrating the visit like a theater production. The house was immaculate. The family was coached to within an inch of their lives, their responses carefully scripted. William himself was a portrait of cooperative concern, expressing appropriate worry about his child's well-being, eager to help in any way possible. The social worker left reassured, another box checked, another case closed. But the teacher wasn't satisfied. Something about the visit's outcome felt wrong, too neat, too perfectly resolved. She couldn't articulate exactly what bothered her, but she trusted her instincts enough to keep watching, keep documenting. And she wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. Other teachers began comparing notes. Patterns emerged across multiple children, consistent behaviors that suggested systematic abuse rather than isolated incidents. William could feel the walls closing in, could sense the scrutiny even when he couldn't see its source. His paranoia intensified, which made him more controlling, which made his family more desperate, which made them more visible in their distress. It was a vicious cycle, and it was accelerating. He tried to tighten his grip, but you can't squeeze water. The harder you press, the more it escapes between your fingers. The break came from an unlikely source: a mandatory medical examination required for school sports participation. A routine physical revealed injuries that couldn't be easily explained away, not just recent trauma but evidence of systematic, long-term abuse. The doctor, legally obligated to report suspicious injuries, made the call that William had been dreading. This time, there would be no advance notice, no opportunity to stage manage the response. When law enforcement arrived for an unannounced welfare check, they found a family in crisis. The mask William had maintained so carefully had slipped, revealing glimpses of the horror beneath. Children who were too terrified to speak coherently. A spouse who looked like she'd been hollowed out from the inside, all emotion and personality extracted, leaving only a shell programmed to survive. And William himself, still trying to charm and manipulate, but doing it with increasing desperation, his explanations becoming more elaborate and less believable. The officers recognized what they were seeing. They'd been trained to identify the markers of severe domestic abuse. But even their training hadn't fully prepared them for the scope and sophistication of William's systematic terrorism. This wasn't simple anger management failure or substance abuse-related violence. This was calculated, intentional, sustained psychological and physical torture conducted by someone who enjoyed the power it gave him and had become addicted to that feeling of absolute control. Removing the family from William's immediate presence was only the first step. The interviews that followed revealed a nightmare that had lasted years, a carefully constructed prison that existed behind ordinary walls in an ordinary neighborhood. Family members described incidents that seemed impossible. How could someone inflict such harm while maintaining such a convincing public persona? How could neighbors live 20 feet away and never hear the screaming? The answer was both simple and chilling. William was exceptionally good at this. He had refined his techniques over time, learning from his mistakes, perfecting his approach. He knew exactly how to calibrate his violence to leave maximum psychological impact while minimizing visible evidence. He understood how to isolate his victims so completely that they lost the ability to even conceptualize escape. He had turned abuse into an art form, and his family had been his unwilling canvas. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered evidence that contradicted every public statement William had ever made, every impression he'd carefully cultivated. Financial records revealed patterns of control through economic abuse. Communications revealed surveillance and manipulation. Physical evidence documented years of violence that had been explained away as accidents, clumsiness, medical conditions. The accumulated weight of this evidence painted a portrait of systematic cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. William's response to being exposed was telling. He didn't collapse or confess. Instead, he doubled down, insisting that he was the victim of misunderstanding, that his family was lying, that vindictive authorities were persecuting him. He maintained his innocence with such conviction that some people who desperately wanted to believe that they hadn't been fooled, continued to support him even as the evidence mounted. He understood that if he could create enough doubt, enough confusion, he might still escape consequences. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony was consistent. Multiple victims told the same story from different perspectives, their accounts corroborating each other in ways that couldn't be coincidental. Medical professionals confirmed injuries consistent with abuse. Mental health experts described psychological trauma that could only result from prolonged, severe maltreatment. William's carefully constructed world was collapsing, and no amount of charm or manipulation could rebuild it. The community that had once embraced William as one of their own now faced an uncomfortable reckoning. They had to confront their own complicity, their own willingness to accept comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. They had to acknowledge that they had prioritized their own psychological comfort over the safety of vulnerable people who were suffering right under their noses. That realization was almost as painful as the abuse itself, because it forced them to recognize their own capacity for willful blindness. The courtroom became a theater of reckoning, a space where carefully maintained lies confronted documented reality. William Dean Christensen entered that room still wearing his mask of wounded innocence, still convinced that his ability to manipulate perception would save him. He underestimated the power of accumulated truth, the weight of evidence so comprehensive that no amount of charisma could counterbalance it. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They built their argument brick by brick, document by document, testimony by testimony, until the structure was so solid that no defense could topple it. They started with the medical evidence, X-rays showing healed fractures that had never been properly treated, scars that formed patterns consistent with deliberate infliction rather than accidental injury, developmental delays caused by chronic stress and malnutrition. Each image projected on the screen was a silent accusation, evidence of harm that William couldn't charm away or explain into innocence. But the medical evidence was just foundation. The real power came from the testimony, from voices that had been silenced for years finally speaking their truth in a forum where they had to be heard. William's family members took the stand one by one, and their collective testimony painted a portrait of domestic terrorism so complete, so thoroughly documented, that even William's most ardent defenders began to waver in their support. The eldest child spoke first, voice shaking but determined. The courtroom fell silent as this young person described a childhood defined entirely by fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of making eye contact, fear of existing too loudly or taking up too much space. They described elaborate punishment systems that were designed not just to cause pain but to create lasting psychological damage. They talked about being forced to participate in their own abuse, to thank William for hurting them, to apologize for making him angry enough to strike. The testimony was clinical in its detail and devastating in its emotional impact. William's spouse testified next, and their account revealed the full sophistication of his manipulation. They described how William had systematically destroyed their sense of reality, convincing them that abuse was love, that control was protection, that isolation was safety. They explained how he had used their children as leverage, threatening harm if they didn't comply, forcing them to choose between their own well-being and their children's safety, a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. They detailed financial abuse that left them completely dependent, social isolation that eliminated support systems, and psychological manipulation so thorough that they had lost the ability to trust their own perceptions. Expert witnesses provided context that helped the jury understand how abuse of this magnitude could remain hidden for so long. Psychologists explained trauma bonding, the paradoxical attachment victims developed to their abusers as a survival mechanism. They described how chronic fear literally rewires the brain, creating patterns of hypervigilance and learned helplessness that can persist for years after the abuse ends. They testified about the calculated nature of William's behavior, explaining how his actions demonstrated clear intent rather than loss of control. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The defense tried multiple strategies, each one failing more spectacularly than the last. They attempted to discredit the victims, suggesting their testimony was coached or exaggerated. They brought character witnesses who insisted William was a good man, a helpful neighbor, someone incapable of the crimes he was accused of committing. They tried to introduce alternative explanations for the injuries, suggesting medical conditions or accidental harm. But each defense argument crumbled under the weight of evidence and the consistency of testimony from multiple independent sources. William himself eventually took the stand, and his testimony revealed the depth of his delusion. He genuinely seemed to believe his own lies, convinced that his version of events, where he was the misunderstood victim of vengeful family members and an overreaching justice system, was the objective truth. He spoke eloquently about his love for his family, his efforts to provide for them, his confusion about how they could make such accusations. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence contradicting them, and his inability to show genuine remorse or empathy revealed exactly what he was: a person fundamentally incapable of seeing others as fully human, someone who viewed his family as possessions to be controlled rather than people deserving of dignity and autonomy. Cross-examination destroyed what remained of William's credibility. The prosecutor methodically walked him through his own contradictions, confronting him with evidence that directly refuted his claims. Medical records he couldn't explain, financial documents showing his control, communications revealing his manipulation. With each piece of evidence, William's composure cracked further, his mask slipping to reveal the rage and narcissism beneath. By the time he left the stand, even his own attorney looked defeated. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. They didn't need dramatic rhetoric or emotional appeals. They simply reviewed the evidence, laying it out piece by piece, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that William Dean Christensen had systematically, intentionally, and remorselessly tortured his own family for years. They argued that this wasn't a case of mistakes or poor judgment. This was calculated cruelty inflicted by someone who enjoyed the power it gave him and felt entitled to exercise that power without constraint. The defense's closing was brief and unconvincing, a desperate attempt to create doubt where none reasonably existed. They asked the jury to consider whether the state had truly proven its case beyond all possible doubt, whether there might be alternative explanations they hadn't considered. But their arguments lacked substance because there was no substantive defense to make. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the testimony too consistent, the pattern too clear. Jury deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on every count. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling, each repetition a vindication for victims who had waited years to hear their truth validated, their suffering acknowledged, their experience believed. William's reaction to the verdict revealed everything about his fundamental character. There was no remorse, no acceptance of responsibility, no acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. Instead, there was rage, pure, undiluted fury at a system that had dared to hold him accountable, at victims who had dared to speak, at a world that had refused to continue enabling his behavior. Even in defeat, he couldn't see his family as people he'd harmed. He saw them only as possessions that had betrayed him, tools that had malfunctioned, objects that had failed to serve their purpose. The sentencing phase brought more testimony, more evidence of the lasting harm William had inflicted. Psychologists described trauma that would require years of treatment to address. Medical professionals outlined physical consequences that might never fully heal. Victims spoke about the ongoing impact of William's abuse, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty forming trusting relationships, the constant sense that safety is an illusion that could shatter at any moment. The judge's sentencing statement was measured but firm. They acknowledged that no punishment could undo the harm William had caused, could restore what he had taken from his victims. But they emphasized the need for accountability, for consequences proportional to the severity and duration of his crimes. The sentence handed down was substantial, decades in prison with minimal possibility of early release. It wouldn't heal William's victims, but it would ensure he couldn't create new ones, couldn't inflict his particular brand of cruelty on anyone else. As William was led from the courtroom, his family watched with complicated emotions. There was relief that he could no longer hurt them, that they were finally truly safe. But there was also grief for the person they had once hoped he might be, for the family they might have had if William had been capable of genuine love instead of just control. There was anger at years stolen, potential destroyed, innocence crushed. And there was a tentative, fragile hope that maybe, finally, they could begin the long process of healing. The community that had once embraced William as one of their own now had to reckon with uncomfortable questions. How had they missed the signs? What did their failure to see reveal about their own values and priorities? How many other families might be suffering in silence behind closed doors? The trial hadn't just exposed William's crimes. It had exposed the collective blindness that had allowed those crimes to continue for so long. Justice, when it finally arrives, never feels quite like we imagined it would. William Dean Christensen's conviction didn't erase the years of abuse, didn't restore what was taken, didn't magically heal the wounds he'd inflicted. It simply drew a line in time, a marker between before and after, between captivity and something that might eventually resemble freedom. But for William's victims, that line was just the beginning of a much longer journey. The immediate aftermath of the trial brought a strange mixture of relief and disorientation. For years, William's family had organized their entire existence around managing his moods, avoiding his anger, surviving his control. Every decision had been filtered through the question, how will he react? Every action had been calculated to minimize danger. Now, suddenly, that central organizing principle was gone. They were free, but freedom after prolonged captivity is more complicated than most people understand. It's not just the absence of constraint. It's the terrifying responsibility of making choices when you've forgotten how to trust your own judgment. Therapy became a central part of their lives, not just for weeks or months, but for years. Healing from trauma this deep and sustained doesn't follow a linear path. There are advances and setbacks, moments of breakthrough and periods of regression. They had to relearn basic skills that most people take for granted: how to recognize their own emotions, how to set boundaries, how to believe they deserved safety and respect. They had to confront the ways William's abuse had shaped their identities, had become woven into how they understood themselves and the world. The children faced particular challenges. They had grown up knowing only dysfunction and fear, had no baseline of healthy family dynamics to reference. They struggled with relationships, with authority figures, with trust. Some developed their own mental health issues, depression, anxiety, PTSD. Others seemed to navigate their trauma more successfully on the surface, but carried invisible wounds that would manifest in unexpected ways years later. Each child's journey was unique, shaped by their age when the abuse was most severe, their individual resilience, and the support systems they managed to build. William's spouse confronted perhaps the most complicated aftermath. They carried not just the trauma of direct victimization, but also the crushing guilt of being unable to protect their children, of staying in a situation that harmed everyone involved. Logically, they understood that they had been as much a victim as anyone, that leaving William would have required resources and support they didn't have. But guilt doesn't respond to logic. They spent years working through feelings of failure and self-blame, gradually learning to redirect that anger toward its appropriate target. Not themselves, but the person who had created the situation in the first place. The community, too, had its own reckoning. Neighbors who had waved to William at block parties, who had borrowed his tools and invited him to barbecues, had to confront their own role in his ability to maintain his facade. Some responded with denial, insisting they had suspected something all along, retroactively revising their memories to include red flags that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Others acknowledged their blindness more honestly, admitting they had prioritized comfort over courage, had chosen to accept easy explanations rather than ask difficult questions. Schools implemented new training programs designed to help educators recognize signs of abuse more effectively. The teacher whose persistence had finally broken through the wall of silence became something of a reluctant hero, though she consistently deflected credit, saying she'd only done what anyone should have done. Her actions had saved lives, but she was haunted by the question of what might have happened if she'd acted sooner, if she'd trusted her instincts earlier. William himself remained unrepentant behind prison walls. He filed multiple appeals, each arguing that he had been railroaded by an unjust system, that his rights had been violated, that the evidence against him had been improperly obtained or interpreted. Each appeal was denied, but he continued to insist on his innocence, continued to cast himself as the victim. He wrote letters claiming persecution, manipulation, conspiracy. He never once acknowledged the harm he'd caused, never showed genuine remorse or empathy for the people he'd tortured. This complete lack of accountability became, paradoxically, one of the things that helped his family heal. There's a particular kind of torment in hoping for an apology that never comes, in waiting for acknowledgement that your suffering was real and undeserved. When it finally became clear that William would never provide that validation, his family stopped waiting for it. They found other sources of validation. In therapy, in support groups, in the simple act of being believed by people who mattered. They stopped centering William in their healing process and focused instead on rebuilding themselves. Years after the trial, his family members had built new lives that bore little resemblance to their existence under William's control. Some had moved far away, creating physical distance that helped establish psychological distance. Others stayed in the same community but reclaimed spaces that had once been defined by fear, transforming them into places of safety and growth. They formed new relationships, some romantic, some platonic, learning slowly to recognize healthy dynamics and trust their ability to identify and escape harmful situations. The children, now adults, processed their trauma in different ways. One became an advocate for abuse survivors, channeling their experience into activism and education. Another pursued psychology, hoping to help others navigate trauma recovery. A third chose a completely different path, building a life that had nothing to do with abuse or trauma work, finding healing in the simple act of living well. There was no right way to move forward, no single path to recovery. Each person had to find their own way at their own pace. But the trauma never completely disappeared. There were triggers, unexpected moments when something would transport them instantly back to the worst days, when fear would flood through them with the same intensity it had years earlier. There were anniversaries of particularly terrible incidents that brought grief and anxiety even when consciously unacknowledged. There were moments of profound loss for the childhoods they never got to have, the family they should have been, the person they might have become if William hadn't systematically destroyed their sense of safety and self-worth. The broader community's response to the case created ripples that extended far beyond the Christensen family. Domestic violence organizations saw increased funding and support. Legislators passed new laws designed to make it easier for victims to escape abusive situations and harder for abusers to maintain control. Training programs for law enforcement, educators, and healthcare providers incorporated lessons from the case, using it as an example of how systematic abuse can remain hidden and what signs might indicate someone is suffering behind closed doors. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. People became more willing to trust their discomfort, to take seriously their suspicions that something might be wrong. They learned that evil doesn't always announce itself obviously, that monsters can look like neighbors and friends. They understood that the cost of being wrong about suspecting abuse is far lower than the cost of being wrong about dismissing it. The case became a catalyst for conversations about how communities can do better at protecting their most vulnerable members. The story of William Dean Christensen doesn't have a neat conclusion because trauma doesn't resolve neatly. His victims continue to heal, continue to build lives worth living, continue to prove that what he did to them doesn't define what they can become. Some days are harder than others. Some wounds reopen when you least expect them. But survival is not passive. It's an active choice made again and again, a refusal to let the person who tried to destroy you have the final word about who you are and what your life means. William remains in prison, aging and angry, unable to accept that his actions had consequences, that the people he viewed as possessions had agency and worth. He represents a particular kind of evil, not the explosive, dramatic violence of sudden rage, but the calculated, sustained cruelty of someone who enjoys causing harm and feels entitled to do so without constraint. Understanding that this kind of evil exists, that it often hides behind masks of normalcy and charm, is essential to preventing future victims. The Christensen case stands as a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the obvious ones. They're the ones who know how to smile while they're destroying you, who understand that the most effective prisons have invisible walls, who recognize that the deepest wounds don't leave visible scars. They're the ones we invite to dinner parties and trust with our children because they've learned to mimic humanity convincingly enough that we don't see the emptiness beneath the performance. But the case also demonstrates resilience, the remarkable capacity of human beings to survive the unsurvivable and build something meaningful from the wreckage. William's family didn't just survive. They reclaimed their lives, their identities, their futures. They proved that while trauma changes you, it doesn't have to destroy you. That healing is possible even when it seems impossible. That the person who hurt you doesn't get to write the final chapter of your story. In the end, the William Dean Christensen case is about more than one man's cruelty. It's about the failures and successes of systems designed to protect the vulnerable. It's about the power of speaking truth even when that truth is terrifying. It's about the responsibility we all share to look beyond comfortable surfaces and acknowledge uncomfortable realities. And it's about the indomitable strength of people who refuse to let the worst thing that ever happened to them be the last thing that defines them. The monster was hunted. The monster was caught. The monster was caged. But more importantly, the people he tried to destroy discovered they were stronger than he ever imagined, more resilient than he believed possible. They survived. They healed. They thrived. And that, ultimately, is the most powerful form of justice. Living well despite everything he did to prevent exactly that. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Professor Who Collected Death. Some men hide behind credentials and charisma while their hands stay warm with blood. In California's sun-scorched valleys, a scholar turned women into lessons in brutality and nearly got away with it. We're tracking a killer who wore respectability like a mask, a man who lectured about the mind while dismantling bodies in the dark. But when investigators finally cornered him, they discovered something more disturbing than his crimes. He'd been hiding in plain sight for decades, protected by the very system meant to stop him. This is the story of Thor Nis Christensen, the scholar, the charmer, the monster. December 1976. Santa Barbara should have felt like paradise. Ocean breezes threading through eucalyptus trees, students laughing on sun-bleached sidewalks, the kind of coastal California beauty that makes people forget darkness exists. But in a drainage ditch off Highway 1, a construction worker discovered what happens when evil wears a friendly face. Mary Saris, 20 years old, lay discarded like refuse, stabbed repeatedly, violated, left to rot in the winter mud while her killer walked freely through the same streets where her friends posted missing person flyers. The brutality spoke of rage, but the precision suggested something colder. Calculation wrapped in violence. A man who'd thought through every cut, every moment of her terror. Mary wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Santa Barbara's law enforcement scrambled, but they were hunting ghosts. No witnesses, no clear motive. Just a young woman's destroyed body and a community beginning to understand that someone among them enjoyed killing. The whispers started in coffee shops and lecture halls. Who could do this? Which face in the crowd belongs to a murderer? Thor Nis Christensen moved through those same spaces like water through fingers. Unremarkable, forgettable, perfectly ordinary. He was the guy you'd ask for help jump-starting your car. The neighbor who smiled and waved. A student of human behavior at San Luis Obispo's University, dissecting psychology textbooks by day while his nights held secrets that would make those textbooks obsolete. Born in Denmark in 1957, Thor carried the kind of background that reads like a tragedy waiting to unfold. His family immigrated to California when he was young, settling into the churning anonymity of American suburbia. He was smart, genuinely brilliant by most accounts, with the kind of sharp intelligence that could dissect an argument or a person with equal efficiency. Teachers called him promising. Friends called him reliable. No one called him dangerous. That was his greatest weapon. By his late teens, Thor had developed an obsession that festered beneath his scholarly exterior. Women weren't people to him. They were objects, puzzles, things to be dominated and discarded. He studied psychology not to heal minds, but to understand how to break them. Every lecture on human behavior became a hunting manual. Every textbook chapter on trauma was research for the trauma he planned to inflict. His first known kill happened in February 1976, though investigators would later wonder if there were others. Bodies never found, crimes never connected to the man who seemed so incapable of violence. Patricia Laney, 19 years old, vanished after leaving a party near Refugio State Beach. She was found days later in a remote canyon, sexually assaulted and stabbed to death with such ferocity that the coroner's report read like a catalog of human destruction. The killing bore Thor's emerging signature: close-range knife wounds, prolonged assault, dumping the body in isolated terrain where discovery might take days or weeks. He wasn't just murdering, he was savoring. Each victim represented hours of horror before death offered mercy. Patricia's murder sent ripples through Santa Barbara's tight-knit community, but those ripples faded. Life continued. Students went to class. Surfers caught waves. The sun kept shining on blood-soaked ground. Thor watched the investigation sputter and fail. He learned what worked. The knife was intimate, terrifying, silent. Isolated locations meant time. Precious, awful time to do what he wanted without interruption. And choosing victims who were alone, vulnerable, trusting, that was simply smart hunting. When Mary Saris crossed his path that December night, Thor wasn't experimenting anymore. He was perfecting his craft. Mary had been at a local bar, celebrating the end of finals with friends. She was bright, studying environmental science, planning to change the world one ecosystem at a time. Those plans died in a drainage ditch when Thor convinced her to accept a ride. Maybe he was charming. Maybe she was just tired and wanted to get home. Maybe it doesn't matter because the outcome was always the same. He drove her to darkness. He unleashed himself on her. And when he finished, he dumped what remained like garbage and went home to sleep peacefully. Detectives working Mary's case noticed similarities to Patricia's murder: the knife wounds, the sexual assault, the remote dumping ground. They theorized about a serial predator but had nothing concrete. No DNA databases existed yet. No surveillance cameras on every corner. Just old-fashioned detective work and the sinking realization that they were chasing someone who understood how to avoid leaving evidence. Thor continued his double life with chilling ease. He attended classes, discussed Freud and Jung, wrote papers about deviant psychology with the kind of insight that only comes from personal experience. Professors praised his work. Fellow students sought his help with assignments. Nobody knew they were getting academic advice from a man whose extracurricular activities involved hunting human beings. The kills continued. February 1977 brought another nightmare. Diane Peterson, 21, disappeared after leaving a friend's house in Goleta. Her body surfaced weeks later in Los Carneros Canyon, subjected to the same violent ritual that had claimed Patricia and Mary. 3 women in 13 months, all young, all brutalized, all disposed of like trash. Santa Barbara's paradise veneer was cracking. Parents pulled daughters from the university. Women stopped walking alone after dark. The fear became palpable, a living thing that changed how an entire community breathed. And Thor? Thor kept studying, kept smiling, kept killing. What makes a man like this? Psychology offers frameworks: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, childhood trauma creating adult monsters. But those clinical terms feel inadequate when confronted with the raw reality of Thor's choices. He wasn't compelled by voices or delusions. He chose this. Every victim was a conscious decision, a moment when he looked at another human being and decided her suffering would bring him pleasure. That's not illness. That's evil selecting its outfit for the evening. By mid-1977, Santa Barbara's investigators were desperate. They formed a task force, brought in FBI profilers, re-interviewed witnesses until their throats went dry. The profile emerged: white male, 20s to 30s, intelligent, socially functional, likely with knowledge of the local terrain. Someone who could blend in, who could make women feel safe enough to get in his car. The description fit half the men in Santa Barbara County, including Thor Nis Christensen, sitting in psychology class, taking notes on predatory behavior while planning his next hunt. May 22nd, 1979. Lydia Preston was 21 years old, working as a waitress while studying theater at UCSB. She had dreams bigger than Santa Barbara could contain. Broadway stages, film sets, her name in lights. Those dreams ended on a Tuesday night when Thor decided she would be victim number 4. But Lydia fought back. Thor had refined his approach by now. He'd offer rides to women walking alone at night, his face open and friendly, his manner unthreatening. Who suspects the helpful stranger? Who fears the man who quotes literature and discusses philosophy? He'd learned that intelligence was camouflage, that cultured conversation disarmed suspicion better than any disguise. Lydia accepted the ride. She was tired, her car was in the shop, and this polite man seemed safe. Another mistake in a series of mistakes that cost women their lives. Thor drove toward the familiar darkness, isolated roads winding into hills where screams dissolved into wind and wilderness. He made small talk, keeping Lydia comfortable until they were far enough from help. Then the mask dropped. He pulled a knife. The blade caught moonlight as he commanded her silence, his voice shifting from friendly to flat, devoid of humanity. This was the real Thor, the creature beneath the costume, and Lydia was staring into the abyss. But unlike Patricia, Mary, and Diane, Lydia wasn't frozen by terror. She was an actress, trained to think on her feet, to improvise, to turn crisis into opportunity. When Thor reached for her, she exploded into motion. She clawed at his face, her fingernails raking flesh, drawing blood. She fought for the knife, her survival instinct overriding the fear that paralyzed so many victims. Thor was stronger, but Lydia was desperate, and desperation fuels impossible strength. They struggled in the confined space of his vehicle, violence compressed into bucket seats and dashboard corners. Lydia managed to open the door, tumbling onto gravel, scrambling away while Thor lunged after her. She ran into darkness, thorny brush tearing her clothes and skin, her lungs screaming, but she ran because stopping meant death. Thor chased her. He'd never had a victim escape before, never had his control challenged like this. Rage and panic mixed dangerously. He needed to silence her, needed to complete what he'd started, needed to maintain the perfect record that defined his identity as predator. Lydia reached a service road and flagged down a passing motorist, a miracle of timing that saved her life. The driver saw her torn clothes, her bleeding face, her wild-eyed terror, and immediately drove her toward safety while Thor melted back into the night. His face scratched and bleeding, evidence now marked on his body. For the first time, Thor Nis Christensen had made a mistake. He'd left a living witness. Lydia's report hit the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office like electricity through water. Finally, they had descriptions, details, a survivor who could identify her attacker. She described his vehicle, a Volkswagen Bug, distinctive coloring, specific model year. She described his face, his voice, his methodical calm that shattered into rage when she resisted. Detectives flooded the area, canvassing for anyone matching the description, anyone driving that particular vehicle. And there he was, Thor Nis Christensen, pulled over 3 days later for a routine traffic stop, his face bearing fresh scratches, his explanation for those scratches thin and unconvincing. When investigators connected him to the vehicle Lydia described, the puzzle pieces began fitting together with terrible clarity. They brought him in for questioning. Thor maintained his composure, the psychology student analyzing his interrogators even as they analyzed him. He denied everything. He had explanations for the scratches, for being in that area, for every suspicious detail. But Lydia identified him without hesitation. That face, the one that had smiled before pulling a knife, was burned into her memory. She'd stared into death and survived, and now she was delivering justice. Thor's apartment yielded more evidence. Investigators found knives, rope, items that suggested predatory planning. They found journals containing disturbing writings, fantasies of domination and violence that read like blueprints for his crimes. And they found trophies, small items taken from victims, keepsakes to remember conquests. The careful, intelligent facade was disintegrating. Beneath the scholarly exterior lived a man who collected suffering like some collect stamps. As investigators dug deeper, connections emerged. Thor had been in the vicinity of every unsolved murder. His class schedule allowed flexibility for nighttime hunting. His psychology studies gave him insight into victim selection and investigative procedures. He'd weaponized his education, turning academic knowledge into tools for better killing. Friends and classmates expressed disbelief when news broke. Thor? No way. He's so normal, so smart, so helpful. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the man who tutored them in psychology be the monster who terrorized Santa Barbara? That's the essential truth about many serial killers. They're not obviously broken. They don't wear signs advertising their monstrosity. They're the neighbor, the coworker, the student sitting beside you in lecture halls. Evil often wears ordinary faces, which is precisely what makes it so terrifying. Thor's arrest made headlines. The Santa Barbara Slayer, captured. Communities exhaled collective relief. Parents stopped clutching their daughters quite so tightly. Women walked at night without glancing over shoulders quite as frequently. But relief mixed with horror as investigators revealed what they'd found. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. Thor had been systematically hunting women, refining his technique, escalating his violence. Each victim represented evolution in his craft. Learning what worked, what satisfied, what allowed him to evade capture. The trial would reveal even darker truths. Prosecutors built their case methodically. Lydia's testimony was devastating. She described every moment of her near murder with clarity that silenced the courtroom. She looked Thor in the eyes and refused to let him have her fear. She'd survived his worst, and now she'd ensure he faced consequences. Forensic evidence connected Thor to the earlier murders. Fibers from Patricia Laney's clothing matched materials in his apartment. Tool marks on Mary Sarris's bones aligned with knives in his possession. Diane Peterson's jewelry, a small silver necklace, sat in Thor's trophy collection, a tangible link between predator and prey. Thor's defense attempted to paint him as disturbed rather than evil, a young man struggling with mental illness who needed treatment rather than punishment. But the evidence told a different story. This was calculated violence, repeated patterns of hunting and killing, pleasure derived from suffering. Thor wasn't sick. He was dangerous. The jury deliberated briefly, guilty on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, sexual assault, kidnapping. Each verdict landed like hammer blows, sealing Thor's fate. At sentencing, victims' families faced the man who'd destroyed their worlds. They spoke of daughters who'd never graduate, never marry, never fulfill the potential stolen by Thor's selfishness. They spoke of sleepless nights haunted by images of final moments, of wondering if their loved ones called for help that never came. Thor showed no remorse. Even facing life imprisonment, he maintained the cold detachment that characterized his crimes. The mask was off permanently now, revealing the emptiness beneath. A man devoid of empathy, incapable of recognizing the humanity in his victims. Understanding Thor Nis Christensen requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature. We want monsters to be obviously monstrous, easily identified and isolated from normal society. But Thor wasn't an aberration. He was a functional member of his community who chose violence as recreation. Psychologists who evaluated Thor during his trial and imprisonment painted a portrait of profound narcissism combined with antisocial traits. He viewed other people as objects existing solely for his use. Women weren't individuals with dreams, fears, and families. They were opportunities for domination, sources of power and pleasure. This worldview didn't develop overnight. Investigators traced Thor's history, finding troubling patterns. Childhood incidents of animal cruelty, dismissed as boyish roughness. Teenage aggression toward female classmates, written off as awkward social development. College-era stalking behaviors, never reported or seriously addressed. Each warning sign was missed or minimized until the behaviors escalated into murder. This pattern repeats across serial killer case studies. Early indicators ignored until bodies accumulate and society can no longer deny what was always there. Thor's intelligence made him particularly dangerous. He understood psychology well enough to manipulate both victims and investigators. He crafted personas tailored to different audiences. The serious student for professors, the helpful friend for peers, the charming stranger for victims. Each mask served a purpose, allowing him to move through life collecting trust while planning violence. His academic focus on psychology wasn't accidental. He studied human behavior to better exploit it. Courses on trauma informed how to inflict it. Lectures on fear taught him to weaponize it. He absorbed knowledge like a parasite, transforming education into instruments of suffering. Prison psychologists who interviewed Thor post-conviction noted his disturbing lack of emotional response when discussing his crimes. He spoke about murdering Patricia, Mary, and Diane with clinical detachment, as if describing laboratory experiments rather than human destruction. The women weren't real to him. They were data points in his exploration of power and control. This emotional void is characteristic of psychopathy, but that diagnosis doesn't excuse his choices. Plenty of people with similar neurological profiles never harm anyone. Thor chose violence. He selected victims, planned attacks, executed murders, and felt satisfaction rather than remorse. Those were conscious decisions, not inevitable outcomes of brain chemistry. What did Thor get from killing? Power, primarily. In his daily life, he was ordinary. Academically gifted but socially unremarkable, blending into crowds without distinction. But when he held a knife to a terrified woman's throat, he was a god deciding life and death. That intoxicating sense of absolute control drove him to kill repeatedly. Sexual gratification played a role, though investigators noted the violence often exceeded what was necessary for assault alone. The stabbing was excessive, personal, rage-filled despite Thor's outward calm. This suggested deeper psychological satisfaction beyond physical pleasure. He enjoyed destroying these women completely, erasing their autonomy and humanity. Thor's journal entries, seized during his arrest, provided chilling insights. He wrote about stalking potential victims, describing their movements and routines with hunter's precision. He detailed fantasies of abduction and torture, refining scenarios before enacting them. He even critiqued his own performances, noting what worked and what could be improved for next time. Reading these journals, investigators realized they were glimpsing pure predation, a human who'd stripped away social conditioning and embraced his darkest impulses. Thor wrote about killing with the same enthusiasm others reserve for hobbies. Murder was his passion, his art, his purpose. Some psychologists theorize that serial killers like Thor are trying to fill an internal void, seeking through violence the connection and meaning they cannot achieve through normal relationships. This theory suggests they're fundamentally damaged, searching for something they'll never find because killing only reinforces their isolation. But this perspective risks humanizing the inhuman. Thor wasn't searching for meaning, he was indulging preferences. He liked hurting women. He enjoyed their fear. He found satisfaction in their deaths. No deeper explanation is required. The question of whether Thor could have been stopped earlier haunts investigators. Were there intervention points, moments when different choices might have prevented murders? The animal cruelty incidents, if properly addressed, might have triggered psychiatric evaluation. The stalking behaviors, if reported and prosecuted, might have created a record preventing future opportunities. But American society in the 1970s lacked the frameworks we now have for identifying and managing dangerous individuals. Domestic violence was barely acknowledged. Stalking wasn't widely criminalized. Warning signs were everywhere, but the systems to interpret and act on them didn't exist. Thor exploited these gaps expertly. He understood intuitively that society wanted to believe in his normalcy, that people resist seeing monsters among them. He leveraged this resistance, hiding in plain sight while accumulating victims. In prison, Thor adapted to his environment with the same calculating precision he'd applied to killing. He maintained distance from other inmates, avoiding the violence that consumes many prisoners. He continued studying, reading voraciously, engaging in correspondence with psychologists and researchers interested in criminal psychology. Some of these researchers reported that Thor seemed to enjoy discussing his crimes academically, as if they were case studies rather than his actions. He offered insights into predatory behavior with disconcerting helpfulness, analyzing himself with the same detachment he once applied to potential victims. This willingness to cooperate frustrated many. Victims' families wanted remorse, acknowledgement of harm, some indication that Thor understood what he'd taken from the world. Instead, they got clinical analysis from a man treating his murders like research data. Does Thor understand what he did was wrong? Intellectually, yes, he grasps social and legal standards condemning murder. But emotionally, genuinely, in the way that prevents normal people from harming others? No. He lacks the empathy circuits that make most humans recoil from causing suffering. For him, right and wrong are abstract concepts, not felt realities. This emotional deficit makes rehabilitation impossible. You cannot teach empathy to someone neurologically incapable of experiencing it. Therapy designed to help people reconnect with emotions doesn't work when those connections never existed. Thor will die in prison, and the world will be safer for it. He represents the uncomfortable reality that some humans are simply incompatible with civilized society. Not because of mental illness or trauma, but because they fundamentally lack the emotional architecture that makes community possible. Understanding this doesn't excuse the systemic failures that allowed Thor to kill multiple women before capture. Law enforcement needed better training in recognizing serial predation patterns. Universities needed protocols for reporting concerning student behavior. Society needed to take violence against women seriously rather than dismissing it as isolated incidents. These lessons, learned in Thor's wake, have shaped modern approaches to sexual violence and serial crime. His case contributed to developing profiling techniques, victim advocacy programs, and multi-jurisdictional task forces. Small consolation for the families destroyed, but perhaps their losses prevented others. Thor's story also highlights the importance of survivors like Lydia Preston. Her courage in fighting back, in surviving, in testifying, she broke the pattern. Without her, Thor might have killed many more women before making a different mistake. Lydia turned her trauma into action, becoming an advocate for assault survivors and speaking publicly about her experience. She refused to let Thor define her, choosing instead to define herself through survival and advocacy. Her strength stands in sharp contrast to Thor's weakness. Real courage versus the cowardice of preying on vulnerable people. In psychological terms, Thor represents an extreme but not unique configuration. High intelligence combined with low empathy, creating someone who understands people well enough to manipulate and harm them effectively. These individuals exist throughout society, though most never escalate to murder. What separates Thor from functional psychopaths who channel their traits into business or politics? Perhaps just opportunity and desire. Thor wanted to kill, had access to victims, and possessed the skills to evade capture temporarily. Different circumstances might have produced different outcomes, but his fundamental nature, predatory, selfish, cruel, would remain unchanged. Thor Nis Christensen sits in a California maximum security facility, aging behind bars while the world moves forward without him. He'll never breathe free air again, never harm another person, never experience the life he stole from 4 women and nearly took from a 5th. But his impact extends far beyond prison walls. Patricia Laney, Mary Saris, Diane Peterson, and the other victims whose names became synonymous with tragedy. Their families live with permanent wounds. Parents who buried children, siblings who lost confidence, friends who carry survivors' guilt, wondering if they could have prevented these deaths. The Laney family speaks publicly about their loss when they can bear it. Patricia was their light, bright, ambitious, full of plans that would never materialize. Her mother describes decades of grief, how holidays feel hollow, how she still sets an extra place at dinner sometimes before remembering. The pain doesn't fade. It just becomes familiar, a constant companion replacing the daughter Thor destroyed. Mary Saris's friends established a scholarship in her name at UCSB, funding environmental science students who share her passion for conservation. It's a small memorial, an attempt to continue the work she'd barely started. Every scholarship recipient represents the future Mary should have had, dreams fulfilled by others because Thor took her chance. Diane Peterson's younger sister, just 15 when Diane was murdered, grew up in the shadow of that loss. She describes feeling like a ghost in her own family, watching parents consumed by grief while trying to navigate adolescence alone. She became a therapist specializing in trauma, turning her pain into purpose, helping others process losses that never fully heal. These ripples extend through communities. Santa Barbara changed after Thor's arrest. The carefree trust that characterized the college town evaporated, replaced by wariness that persists today. Parents warn daughters about accepting rides. Women walk in groups after dark. The paradise lost its innocence, learning that evil doesn't announce itself. It smiles and offers help before striking. Law enforcement agencies studied Thor's case extensively, identifying failures and developing improved protocols. The Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office implemented better coordination with neighboring jurisdictions, ensuring information about similar crimes gets shared quickly. They trained investigators in victimology, understanding victim selection patterns to identify serial predators earlier. The FBI incorporated lessons from Thor's case into their behavioral analysis unit, refining profiles of sexually motivated serial killers. His pattern of victim selection, dumping sites, and escalating violence became teaching material for agents learning to hunt human monsters. Universities enhanced campus safety programs, establishing escort services, emergency call boxes, and awareness campaigns about acquaintance danger. The myth of stranger danger as the primary threat gave way to harder truths. Most violence against women comes from acquaintances, from seemingly normal men who hide predatory natures behind friendly facades. Lydia Preston's survival sparked important conversations about resistance during sexual assault. For decades, women were taught passive compliance. Don't fight back, don't risk escalating violence, just survive. But Lydia fought, and that fighting saved her life. Her experience challenged conventional wisdom, validating resistance as a viable survival strategy depending on circumstances. She wrote a book about her experience, raw and unflinching in its honesty. She described the moment Thor's mask dropped, the cold calculation in his eyes when he revealed his intentions. She detailed the fight, the desperate scramble for survival, the aftermath of trauma and recovery. Her voice gave other survivors permission to speak, to resist the shame society too often inflicts on victims. I refuse to be defined by what he tried to do to me, Lydia wrote. He tried to make me another victim, another body, another statistic. Instead, I'm a survivor, an advocate, a voice for the women who didn't get to speak. That's my revenge, living fully while he rots in a cage. Thor's family disappeared into anonymity after his conviction, changing their names, moving far from California. They released one statement through attorneys. We are devastated by the suffering Thor caused. These families have our deepest sympathies. We cannot explain or excuse his actions. We only hope they find some peace knowing he can never hurt anyone again. Imagine living with that knowledge your son, brother, relative is a serial killer. How do you reconcile the person you knew with the monster revealed in court? Some families stand by their convicted relatives, insisting on innocence despite evidence. Thor's family chose distance, unable to bridge the gap between who they thought he was and who he actually became. Did they miss signs? Were there moments when they wondered about Thor's psychology, his detachment, his strange fascinations? Or was he skilled enough to hide his nature even from those closest to him? These questions haunt families of killers, the perpetual wondering if they could have prevented horror. Criminologists debate Thor's motives endlessly. Was he born predisposed to violence, genetic factors creating a killer? Or did environmental factors, family dynamics, social pressures, cultural influences, shape him into what he became? The nature versus nurture argument applied to someone whose nature was murder. The truth likely involves both. Thor may have had neurological differences that dampened empathy and increased aggression. But plenty of people share those traits without becoming killers. His choices transformed potential into action. He decided to hunt women. He decided to kill. He decided his pleasure mattered more than their lives. This agency matters when discussing serial killers. Framing them purely as victims of genetics or trauma removes accountability, suggesting they couldn't help themselves. But Thor helped himself to opportunities for violence, to victims he selected, to satisfaction derived from suffering. Those were choices conscious and deliberate. As Thor ages in prison, occasionally giving interviews to researchers, he remains unchanged fundamentally. He discusses his crimes with intellectual curiosity but emotional vacancy. He analyzes what worked and what didn't as if reviewing chess games rather than murders. The human cost never registers. Parole is theoretically possible someday, though extremely unlikely given his crimes and lack of remorse. Every few years, parole boards review his case. Every few years, victims' families write impact statements explaining why he must remain imprisoned. Every few years, the answer is the same: Thor Nis Christensen is too dangerous for freedom. He'll likely die behind bars, growing old surrounded by other violent men. His world shrunk to concrete and steel. There's justice in that. He confined his victims to graves, and now he's confined to a cell. Not equivalent punishments, perhaps, but the best society can offer. The women Thor killed remain forever young in photographs and memories. Patricia, frozen at 19, her whole life ahead. Mary, 20, with environmental dreams unrealized. Diane, 21, possibilities cut short. They deserved decades Thor stole, families they'll never raise, impacts they'll never make. We remember them not just as victims, but as people. Patricia loved hiking and wanted to work for the National Park Service. Mary volunteered at animal shelters and dreamed of protecting endangered species. Diane was studying journalism, planning to expose injustice through investigative reporting. These weren't just bodies, they were futures, erased by a man who saw them only as objects. Their families transformed grief into action. They advocate for victims' rights, pushing legislation that strengthens consequences for violent crimes. They support organizations helping assault survivors. They speak at universities, warning students about the dangers of misplaced trust. Their daughters' deaths became unwilling catalysts for change. Thor Nis Christensen will be forgotten eventually, his name fading from public consciousness as new horrors capture attention. But Patricia, Mary, Diane, and other victims deserve remembrance. They weren't just footnotes in a killer's story. They were the main characters in their own lives, narratives Thor violently interrupted but couldn't completely erase. Lydia Preston ensures this. Through her advocacy, she keeps their memories alive, speaking their names, sharing their stories. She survived so she could bear witness, so the world would know these women as people rather than statistics. Every time I tell my story, Lydia says, I'm telling theirs too. I'm saying their names. I'm reminding people that behind every crime statistic is a human being with family and friends and dreams. Thor tried to reduce us all to objects, to disposable things. I won't let him. We were people. We are people. And we matter. That's the final word on Thor Nis Christensen. Not his crimes, not his psychology, not his twisted satisfaction. The final word belongs to the women he targeted, the survivors who refused victimhood, the families who turned grief into purpose. Thor is nothing now. Just a number in a cell, a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters wear ordinary faces. But Patricia, Mary, Diane, and Lydia, they're everything Thor never understood. Humanity, connection, love, legacy. He took their lives, or tried to, but he couldn't take their meaning. That's the real horror and the real hope. Evil exists and destroys, but it doesn't triumph completely. We remember the victims. We honor their lives. We fight for justice. And sometimes we survive and make sure the world knows that monsters don't win. Not really, not in the ways that matter most. Thor Nis Christensen killed because he enjoyed power over others. But the power belongs to those who survived him, who remember his victims, who ensure their stories outlive his crimes. That's the legacy, not what he did, but what they represented and continue to represent. Humanity, dignity, and the refusal to let evil have the last word. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Shadow Curator, Christopher Joseph Edwards' Catalog of Carnage. In the suffocating stillness of a mortuary cooler, where death is sanitized and grief becomes procedure, one man discovered that his proximity to the deceased offered something far more intoxicating than empathy. It offered absolute dominion over the defenseless, and in that realization, humanity's most ancient nightmare took shape behind sterile walls and fluorescent lights. What transforms a healer into a predator? What darkness gestates in the mind of someone entrusted with our most vulnerable moments, only to have them weaponize that sacred trust into an instrument of unspeakable violation? Christopher Joseph Edward didn't hunt his victims through shadowed alleyways or desolate roads. He didn't need to. They came to him already conquered by the ultimate vulnerability, death itself. And in those sterile chambers where society places its final goodbyes, he conducted a symphony of desecration so profound, so methodically evil, that it would shatter our fundamental assumptions about where monsters dwell. This isn't simply the chronicle of heinous acts committed in darkness. This is the documentation of a predator who understood that the greatest camouflage isn't invisibility, it's respectability. A man who wore the uniform of compassion while performing rituals of degradation. A creature who smiled at grieving families even as their loved ones became exhibits in his private gallery of horrors. Before we descend into this abyss together, understand this. The details that follow aren't shared for shock value or morbid entertainment. They're shared because forgetting would be the final disrespect to those who suffered. They're shared because evil unexposed is evil emboldened. They're shared because Christopher Joseph Edward counted on silence, on discomfort, on society's reluctance to confront the unconfrontable. He wagered everything on our collective squeamishness, and for far too long he won that bet. Steel yourself. The story ahead will challenge your faith in institutional safeguards and human decency. But bear witness anyway, because that's what justice demands. Adelaide, South Australia. A city of churches and cultivated gardens, where propriety runs as deep as the roots of ancient river red gums. In this environment of measured politeness and civic pride, certain professions carry the weight of unspoken reverence. Among these, the mortuary technician occupies a unique position, gatekeeper between the living and the dead, custodian of final dignity, trusted handler of what remains when consciousness departs. Christopher Joseph Edward entered this profession in the early years of the new millennium, presenting himself as precisely what the role demanded: meticulous, respectful, professionally detached yet appropriately solemn. His credentials were unremarkable but sufficient. His demeanor suggested someone who understood the gravity of working with the deceased, who recognized that families entrusted him with treasures beyond price during their most devastating hours. The anatomical pathology department at the facility where Edward secured employment operated with the mechanical precision typical of such institutions. Bodies arrived. Examinations occurred. Reports were filed. Remains were prepared for return to families or for burial. The cycle repeated with bureaucratic regularity, each case documented in triplicate, each procedure following established protocols that had been refined over decades. Edward absorbed these rhythms quickly. He learned the terminology, the techniques, the expectations. More importantly, he learned the gaps, those interstices in supervision where individual judgment replaced direct observation, where trust substituted for verification, where the sheer volume of deceased individuals passing through the facility created an environment of assumed compliance rather than confirmed adherence to standards. In those gaps, something monstrous began to breathe. The initial violations likely started small, tentative explorations of boundary transgression. A lingering touch where professional necessity didn't require it. A photographed image captured under the pretense of documentation but preserved for entirely different purposes. These preliminary incursions into depravity would have tested the waters, gauging whether detection mechanisms existed, whether his activities triggered any institutional alarm systems. They didn't. Emboldened by this absence of consequence, Edward's violations metastated into something far more sinister. The mortuary cooler, that temperature-controlled vault where the dead awaited processing, became his private theater of degradation. Here, behind sealed doors and amid the chemical preservatives and stainless steel instruments of post-mortem examination, he enacted scenarios of sexual violation upon those utterly incapable of resistance or protest. The victims were women, though that term feels inadequate for individuals who had already suffered death's ultimate theft of agency, only to have their remains subjected to predatory abuse. Some had died in accidents, their lives severed suddenly and without warning. Others had succumbed to illness, their bodies finally surrendering after prolonged struggle. A few were elderly, having completed long lives before death claimed them. Their diversity was meaningless to Edward. What mattered was their availability, their vulnerability, their complete inability to refuse or report his actions. He violated them with his body. He positioned them according to his perverse preferences. He documented his crimes with digital images, creating an archive of atrocity that would eventually number in the thousands. The photography served multiple purposes. It provided material for his ongoing gratification, it allowed him to revisit and relive his violations, and perhaps most disturbingly, it suggested an element of pride, a desire to catalog and preserve his acts as though they were achievements worthy of commemoration. The psychological architecture undergirding such behavior defies comfortable explanation. Normal sexual response requires reciprocity, engagement, the dynamic exchange between conscious participants. Edward's actions represented something fundamentally different, an attraction not merely indifferent to the absence of consent but specifically aroused by absolute powerlessness. The dead cannot resist. They cannot express disgust or fear. They cannot fight back or flee. For a predator seeking the purest expression of dominance, they represent the ultimate subjects. Medical literature documents similar cases, though mercifully rare. Necrophilia, the sexual attraction to corpses, classified among the paraphilious, those atypical patterns of sexual interest that deviate dramatically from normative human behavior. The condition intersects with other psychological phenomena: extreme objectification, profound dissociation from empathy, narcissistic entitlement, antisocial personality structures. But clinical terminology, however precise, fails to capture the visceral horror of the acts themselves, the methodical degradation Edward inflicted upon the defenseless deceased. His employment environment facilitated rather than hindered his predation. The mortuary operated on trust-based systems common to many institutional settings. Technicians worked independently during certain shifts. The deceased, once received and logged, remained in cooling chambers until scheduled for examination or preparation. Privacy was assumed necessary for maintaining dignity during sensitive procedures. These structural features, designed to ensure respectful handling, inadvertently created perfect conditions for Edward's crimes. The families who entrusted their loved ones to this facility remained entirely unaware. They signed release forms, approved cremations or burials, held funerals and memorials, all while Edward's violations remained hidden behind institutional walls. The disconnection between their grief-filled experiences and the reality occurring in the mortuary represents a particularly cruel dimension of these crimes. Not only were the deceased victimized, but their families' mourning processes were poisoned by violations they couldn't even imagine were occurring. During this period, Edward's life outside the mortuary appeared unremarkable. He maintained social relationships, participated in routine activities, presented no obvious red flags to casual observers. The compartmentalization required to function normally in public while committing such extreme violations privately suggests a personality structure capable of profound deception and moral disengagement. He wasn't a raving madman. He was a calculated predator who understood societal expectations well enough to mimic them convincingly while pursuing his abhorrent compulsions in secret. The duration of his predatory behavior remains subject to some uncertainty, but evidence suggests it spanned multiple years. During this extended period, the number of victims accumulated steadily. Each body that passed through his care became a potential target. Each shift worked alone provided opportunity. The crimes compounded, creating a cascade of violations that transformed what should have been a place of dignity and final respect into a hunting ground for a predator in medical scrubs. The technological dimension of his crimes, the compulsive documentation, would ultimately prove decisive. Each image Edward captured and preserved represented not merely evidence of individual violations, but a growing digital archive that, once discovered, would provide irrefutable proof of systematic, repeated criminal conduct. His apparent need to record and retain these materials, to build what amounted to a personal museum of depravity, contained the seeds of his eventual exposure. But that exposure remained years away. For now, in the cool sterility of the mortuary, surrounded by the chemical tang of formaldehyde and the institutional hum of refrigeration units, Christopher Joseph Edward continued his violations unchecked, each day bringing new opportunities for desecration, each victim adding to a hidden tally of crimes that would eventually shock an entire nation and force uncomfortable questions about institutional oversight, professional ethics, and the dark possibilities lurking within positions of sacred trust. The deceased could not scream, they could not resist, they could not report, and so the violations continued, hidden in plain sight within a facility designed to honor the dead, perpetrated by a man whose professional role granted him precisely the access and privacy his predatory nature required. As Edward's confidence grew with each unpunished violation, his activities evolved in disturbing directions. The mortuary provided a steady supply of victims, but his compulsions apparently demanded expansion, diversification of his predatory portfolio. The psychological mechanism driving this escalation is grimly familiar to forensic specialists. Successful predation without consequence reinforces the behavior, while habituation to existing stimuli drives the search for novel experiences that can generate the same neurological rewards. Edward began seeking additional avenues for his necrophilic impulses. He cultivated relationships within the broader death care industry, networking with funeral directors, crematorium operators, and others whose professions granted access to the deceased. These connections weren't random. They were strategic, carefully developed to expand his opportunities for violation while maintaining the facade of professional collegiality. The funeral industry, like many specialized fields, operates as a somewhat insular community. Professionals regularly interact across institutional boundaries, sharing resources, referring clients, collaborating on challenging cases. Edward weaponized these normal professional connections, transforming what should have been ethical collaborations into networks that facilitated his crimes. During this period, he also began traveling, ostensibly for professional development conferences, continuing education seminars, or personal tourism. The true purpose, evidence would later suggest, involved seeking opportunities in different jurisdictions where his face and patterns weren't known, where he could potentially access other facilities, other victims, other chances to indulge his compulsions without the accumulated risk of operating repeatedly in familiar territory. The geographic expansion of his crimes, if indeed it occurred as investigators later suspected, demonstrates a level of criminal sophistication beyond mere opportunistic predation. He was thinking strategically, managing risk, diversifying his activities across multiple locations to reduce the probability of pattern detection. This calculated approach reveals much about Edward's personality. He wasn't acting on uncontrollable impulse alone, but rather combining compulsive drive with rational planning, perhaps the most dangerous combination in criminal psychology. Meanwhile, his digital archive continued growing. The images he compulsively collected weren't merely stored. They were organized, cataloged, maintained with the same meticulous attention he applied to his professional mortuary work. This systematic documentation reveals the psychological importance of the archive to Edward's pathology. The physical acts of violation provided immediate gratification, but the images served ongoing needs. They allowed repeated mental revisitation of his crimes, they provided material for future arousal, and they represented trophies, proof of his violations, evidence of power exercised over the utterly powerless. Forensic analysis of digital evidence in such cases often reveals chilling details about the perpetrator's mindset. File naming conventions, organization systems, metadata timestamps, all provide windows into how the offender conceptualized their crimes. In Edward's case, the methodical nature of his archive suggested someone who viewed his violations not as shameful acts to be hidden and forgotten, but as accomplishments to be preserved and curated. The mortuary wasn't just his workplace. It was his gallery, and the deceased weren't just victims but exhibits in his private museum of depravity. The psychological toll on Edward himself during this period remains speculative. Did he experience guilt, shame, or internal conflict? Or had his moral framework become so thoroughly distorted that he genuinely felt entitled to these violations, viewing them as perquisites of his position? Evidence suggests the latter. His continued employment, his maintenance of social relationships, his apparent lack of behavioral deterioration, all indicate someone operating within their own twisted ethical system rather than someone tormented by conscience. The institutional environment continued enabling his crimes through systemic vulnerabilities. Background checks at hiring had been cursory. Supervision remained intermittent. The assumption that professional certification and employment history indicated trustworthiness created blind spots that Edward expertly exploited. Moreover, the inherent discomfort surrounding death and dead bodies meant that even when anomalies occurred, unexplained time gaps, unusual access patterns, technical irregularities, they were more likely to be rationalized away than confronted directly. This institutional complicity, though unintentional, deserves examination. The facility where Edward worked wasn't uniquely negligent. Rather, it reflected standard practices across similar institutions nationwide. The uncomfortable truth is that systems designed around trust and professional courtesy, while generally effective, become catastrophically inadequate when confronted with calculating predators willing to exploit those very qualities. Edward understood intuitively what institutional designers often overlook. The greatest vulnerabilities aren't technical but human, rooted in our reluctance to suspect colleagues of unthinkable behavior. During these years, multiple bodies passed through Edward's care. Elderly women who had lived full lives, young accident victims whose deaths devastated families, middle-aged individuals claimed by sudden illness. Each represented a daughter, mother, sister, grandmother, friend, a complete human being with decades of relationships, experiences, accomplishments. Each deserved dignity in death. Each received violation instead. The families of these victims continued their lives entirely unaware that their loved ones had suffered post-mortem abuse. They held funerals, scattered ashes, visited graves, preserved memories, all while Edward's crimes remained completely hidden. This unknowing victimization represents a particularly cruel dimension of necrophilic offenses. Unlike crimes against the living, where victims or witnesses can report abuse and seek justice, crimes against the dead rely entirely on external detection mechanisms. The deceased cannot advocate for themselves. They cannot demand investigation. They remain silent, and that silence empowers their violators. Edward's apparent success during this period, his continued employment, his maintenance of social relationships, his avoidance of detection, likely reinforced his sense of invulnerability. Each day without consequence, each violation completed without discovery, each photograph added to his archive without triggering institutional alarm, all contributed to a growing confidence that he was beyond reach, that his particular predilection was somehow exempt from the normal consequences accompanying criminal behavior. This confidence, this sense of impunity, is characteristic of serial offenders who operate over extended periods. They begin to view their success not as luck but as deserved outcome, evidence of their superior intelligence or special entitlement. They start taking risks, pushing boundaries, expanding their activities. The psychological phenomenon is well documented. Sustained success at evading detection actually increases risk-taking behavior rather than promoting caution. Edward was following a familiar trajectory, one that ultimately leads to either dramatic escalation or catastrophic exposure. His technological practices during this period also reflected increasing boldness. Rather than limiting his digital archive to secure, isolated devices, evidence suggests he began accessing his collection through various means, creating digital footprints that would later prove evidentially significant. The compulsion to revisit his materials apparently outweighed rational security considerations, another common pattern among offenders whose psychological needs override their strategic judgment. The mortuary itself continued functioning normally from external perspectives. Families received their loved ones' remains on schedule. Reports were filed appropriately. The facility maintained its reputation and accreditation. The surface normalcy masked the profound corruption occurring within, a corruption facilitated by privacy requirements, trust-based systems, and the universal human tendency to avoid confronting deeply disturbing possibilities. Meanwhile, Edward's violations continued accumulating. Each represented not merely a criminal act but a fundamental betrayal of societal trust. Society grants extraordinary access to certain professionals based on necessity and faith. Physicians touch our bodies because healing requires it. Mortuary workers handle our deceased because someone must, and we entrust them to do so respectfully. When someone in such a position exploits that access for predatory purposes, they don't merely harm their direct victims. They poison the entire system of trust that allows these professions to function. The scope of Edward's crimes during this period, the sheer number of violations, the systematic nature of his predation, the methodical documentation, places his offending among the most extensive cases of institutional necrophilic abuse documented in criminal history. He wasn't an impulsive offender who committed isolated acts. He was a calculating predator who transformed his professional environment into a hunting ground and operated within it for years, accumulating victims at a pace that would eventually shock the investigators and prosecutors who reviewed his full case file. Discovery, when it finally arrived, came through a pathway Edward apparently never anticipated. His downfall didn't result from a suspicious colleague or institutional audit, but from an entirely different investigation that intersected with his criminal activities through technological means. Law enforcement, while pursuing an unrelated matter, encountered digital evidence that raised alarming questions. Questions that led investigators down a rabbit hole culminating in the exposure of Edward's horrific archive. The initial discovery was accidental from the perspective of Edward's crimes. Investigators conducting digital forensics on another case encountered materials that didn't fit the investigation's expected parameters, but clearly depicted criminal conduct. The images showed what appeared to be post-mortem sexual abuse, documented with disturbing clarity. The investigation immediately expanded to identify the source of these materials and the scope of the criminal behavior they represented. Tracing digital evidence backward from discovery to origin requires specialized expertise. Investigators must analyze metadata, track file transfers, identify devices, establish timelines, and ultimately connect specific materials to specific individuals. In Edward's case, this process led directly to him, his devices, his accounts, his employment at the mortuary facility. The technological trail he'd created while compulsively documenting his crimes became the pathway to his exposure. When authorities approached facility administrators with their preliminary findings, the institutional response combined shock, denial, and eventually horrified acceptance. The idea that a trusted employee had been systematically violating the deceased seemed incomprehensible, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Edward's access, his schedules, the timestamps on images matching his shifts, all pointed toward one inescapable conclusion. They had employed a predator who'd transformed their facility into his personal hunting ground. The legal machinery moved swiftly once the scope of Edward's crimes became apparent. Search warrants were executed on his residence and personal devices, yielding thousands upon thousands of images documenting violations spanning multiple years. Each photograph represented both evidence of a crime and testimony from victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The deceased, violated in the most profound way imaginable, could offer no statements, no testimony, no emotional recounting of their trauma. The images had to speak instead, and they told a story of systematic, repeated, methodical predation conducted behind institutional walls by someone entrusted with sacred responsibilities. Edward was arrested and charged with multiple counts of criminal conduct involving the deceased. The specific charges varied by jurisdiction and legal framework, but they collectively addressed the sexual violation of corpses, abuse of position, and related offenses. The legal system was forced to confront crimes that many statutes had never explicitly contemplated, requiring prosecutors to apply existing laws to circumstances that defied comfortable categorization. The investigation expanded to identify victims. This process presented extraordinary challenges. Many bodies Edward had accessed had been subsequently cremated, eliminating physical evidence. Families had buried their loved ones or scattered their ashes, unaware that violation had occurred. In many cases, the only evidence was photographic, images that investigators had to review, attempt to identify, and then face the devastating task of potentially informing families that their deceased relatives had been abused. The ethical dilemmas surrounding victim notification in such cases are profound. On one hand, families arguably have a right to know what occurred to their loved ones. On the other hand, informing them imposes knowledge that will forever poison their memories and grieving processes. What's gained by telling an elderly parent that their deceased daughter was sexually violated in the mortuary? What's lost by maintaining silence? There are no good answers, only terrible choices between competing harms. Law enforcement and prosecutors developed a framework for handling these notifications, attempting to balance transparency with compassion. Some families were informed when identification was certain, and investigators believed notification served investigative or therapeutic purposes. Others were spared the knowledge when investigators determined that notification would cause only additional suffering without serving justice or healing. These decisions were made case by case, with agonizing care and never with complete confidence about the correct course. The media eventually obtained details of the case, and Edward's arrest became major news across Australia and internationally. Headlines attempted to convey the nature of his crimes without excessive graphic detail. A balance between public's right to information and respect for victims and their families. The coverage sparked national conversations about mortuary oversight, professional standards, institutional accountability, and the adequacy of existing legal frameworks for addressing such crimes. Public reaction combined revulsion, anger, and deep unease. The mortuary, an institution most people prefer not to think about, suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny. Questions emerged. How could this happen? Why hadn't oversight mechanisms detected the abuse? Were similar violations occurring at other facilities? Could families trust that their loved ones were being treated respectfully? The case shook fundamental assumptions about institutional reliability and professional integrity. For the facility where Edward worked, the consequences were severe. Reputation damage was immediate and profound. Families who had used their services experienced secondary trauma, wondering whether their loved ones had been among Edward's victims. Staff members faced suspicion despite having no knowledge of his crimes. The institution itself underwent comprehensive reviews of protocols, oversight, and accountability mechanisms, reviews that revealed systemic vulnerabilities but also demonstrated the difficulty of preventing determined predators from exploiting positions of trust. Edward's legal defense faced extraordinary challenges. The evidence was overwhelming, thousands of images directly documenting his crimes, digital metadata confirming his authorship and possession, forensic analysis tying materials to his devices and accounts. There was no plausible innocent explanation, no alternative theory that could account for the evidence. The defense strategy necessarily focused on mitigation rather than innocence, attempting to frame Edward's behavior through medical and psychological lenses that might generate some sympathy or at least reduce sentencing severity. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted to assess Edward's mental state and psychological functioning. These evaluations revealed a complex profile. He demonstrated no evidence of psychosis or severe mental illness that would impair his understanding of right and wrong. Instead, evaluations identified paraphilic disorders, personality features consistent with antisocial patterns, profound empathy deficits, and moral reasoning distortions. In lay terms, he knew his actions were wrong by societal and legal standards, but his internal value system was so distorted that this knowledge didn't translate into behavioral restraint. The prosecution built a comprehensive case documenting the scope and nature of Edward's offending. They prepared evidence exhibits from the thousands of images in his possession, selecting representative samples that clearly demonstrated criminal conduct while attempting to maintain respect for victims' dignity. They compiled timelines showing years of systematic violation. They documented his access and opportunity through employment records. They established beyond any doubt that Christopher Joseph Edward had committed crimes of profound depravity against the defenseless deceased over an extended period. The victims, in a legal sense, were the deceased individuals Edward had violated. But the true victim pool extended far beyond, to their families who endured secondary trauma from learning about the abuse, to other families who used the facility during Edward's tenure and lived with uncertainty about whether their loved ones were targeted, to staff members whose professional reputations were tarnished by association, to the broader community whose faith in institutional integrity was shaken, and perhaps to society itself, forced to confront the dark reality that positions of sacred trust can harbor predators who exploit precisely that trust for predatory ends. As the case moved toward resolution, the legal system grappled with appropriate punishment for crimes that defied easy categorization. The deceased victims had not suffered physical pain. They were beyond such suffering. But their dignity had been profoundly violated, their remains desecrated, their families' trust betrayed. What sentence adequately addresses such crimes? What punishment fits offending that combines sexual violence with abuse of position, institutional betrayal with systematic predation, and impacts hundreds or thousands of victims across many years? Christopher Joseph Edwards' case proceeded through the judicial system with the grim inevitability of overwhelming evidence meeting undeniable guilt. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, building an irrefutable record of systematic criminal conduct. The defense offered mitigation evidence, psychiatric evaluations suggesting psychological abnormality, personal history attempting to contextualize his behavior, expressions of remorse that rang hollow given the scope and duration of his crimes. The legal proceedings required confronting uncomfortable questions about appropriate punishment. Necrophilic offenses occupy a strange space in criminal law. They're universally condemned yet often carry sentences lighter than crimes against living victims. The reasoning is that the deceased cannot suffer in the traditional sense, cannot experience the ongoing trauma that accompanies violent victimization of the living. Yet this reasoning feels inadequate when confronting the sheer scale of Edwards' violations and the profound betrayal they represented. Prosecutors argued for maximum sentences, emphasizing the systematic nature of his predation, the abuse of his professional position, the violation of sacred trust, and the extensive victim count. They presented Edward as someone who had demonstrated complete moral bankruptcy, who had transformed an institution dedicated to honoring the dead into his personal hunting ground, who had shown no authentic remorse beyond self-pity at being caught. The defense countered with arguments about Edward's psychological abnormalities, his paraphilic disorders that supposedly diminished his culpability, his lack of prior criminal history, and his potential for rehabilitation through intensive treatment. They suggested that lengthy incarceration served no purpose beyond retribution, that Edward posed no danger to the living, and that society's interests would be better served by treatment-focused interventions rather than purely punitive imprisonment. The court faced the challenge of balancing competing interests: punishment proportionate to offense, deterrence of future similar crimes, protection of public safety, acknowledgement of victims' dignity, and recognition of institutional failures that enabled Edwards' predation. The judicial decision needed to send clear messages about the seriousness of necrophilic abuse, the breach of professional trust, and society's commitment to protecting the dignity of the deceased, even when they can no longer protect themselves. When sentencing arrived, the judge delivered a comprehensive statement addressing the nature of Edwards' crimes, their impact on victims' families and institutional trust, and the need for punishment that reflected community condemnation of such behavior. The sentence included significant prison time, years behind bars where Edward would be stripped of the professional position he'd exploited, separated from access to the deceased, and forced to confront the magnitude of his betrayals. Beyond imprisonment, the sentence included post-release conditions, extended supervision, treatment requirements, prohibitions on employment in death care industries, and restrictions designed to prevent any future access to deceased individuals. The court recognized that Edwards' paraphilic interests likely represented enduring psychological features requiring lifetime management rather than conditions subject to cure through time or treatment alone. The facility where Edward worked faced its own reckoning. Comprehensive reviews identified systemic vulnerabilities, inadequate supervision, trust-based systems lacking verification mechanisms, privacy protocols that inadvertently created opportunities for abuse, and insufficient background checks on employees granted intimate access to the deceased. The institution implemented substantial reforms: enhanced surveillance in mortuary areas, mandatory dual technician requirements for certain procedures, more rigorous background investigations, regular audits of access patterns, and improved training addressing professional boundaries and ethical conduct. These institutional reforms, while necessary, arrived too late for Edward's victims. The deceased he'd violated remained violated. Their families' traumatic knowledge remained traumatic. The betrayal of trust remained irreparable. Institutional reforms can prevent future similar crimes, but they cannot undo past harms. A frustrating reality that institutional administrators, victims' families, and the broader public all confronted during the aftermath of Edward's exposure. The broader death care industry examined the case for lessons applicable to their own operations. Professional associations issued guidance on preventing similar abuses. Training programs incorporated case studies addressing boundary violations and ethical responsibilities. Facilities nationwide reviewed their oversight mechanisms, recognizing that Edward's predation represented not an isolated aberration but a warning about vulnerabilities inherent in any system granting individuals private access to the vulnerable, whether living or deceased. For law enforcement and prosecutors, the case highlighted challenges specific to crimes against the deceased. Traditional investigative techniques assuming living victims who can report crimes, provide testimony, and collaborate with investigations obviously don't apply. Detection of necrophilic abuse depends almost entirely on external mechanisms, surveillance systems, whistleblowers, accidental discoveries, or intersections with other investigations. This structural reality means such crimes likely remain significantly underreported and underdetected, a disturbing thought that haunted investigators even after successfully prosecuting Edward. The psychological and therapeutic communities examined Edward's case for insights into necrophilic paraphilias. His systematic documentation of violations provided unusual research opportunities, troubling but scientifically valuable data about the psychological dynamics of such offending. Academic literature emerged analyzing patterns in his behavior, attempting to identify risk factors that might improve prevention and early detection of similar offenders in the future. Victims' families who learned of Edward's crimes faced devastating choices about how to process this knowledge. Some sought counseling to address the secondary trauma of discovering their loved ones had been violated. Others struggled in isolation, unwilling or unable to share such disturbing information even with close family members. A few became advocates, speaking publicly about the need for institutional reforms and greater oversight of death care professionals. Each family navigated their own path through terrain where no guideposts existed and no approach felt adequate to the situation. The public discourse surrounding Edward's case raised profound ethical and philosophical questions. What does dignity mean for the deceased? Do the dead have rights? And if so, what grounds those rights given their incapacity for experience or suffering? How should society balance respect for the deceased against practical considerations like resource allocation for oversight systems? These questions admitted no easy answers, but the case forced their confrontation in ways that purely academic discussions never could. Media coverage evolved from initial sensationalism toward more thoughtful examination of systemic issues. Journalists investigated oversight mechanisms at other facilities, interviewed death care professionals about industry practices, and examined legal frameworks governing treatment of the deceased. The coverage served important functions: maintaining public attention on a case that defied comfortable dismissal, demanding accountability from institutions and policymakers, and ensuring that Edward's crimes catalyzed meaningful reform rather than merely shocking headlines that faded from memory. Christopher Joseph Edward himself, imprisoned and stripped of the position he'd exploited, reportedly participated in treatment programs addressing his paraphilic interests and psychological distortions. Whether such treatment could genuinely transform someone who'd engaged in such extensive predation over so many years remained uncertain. The therapeutic literature on paraphilia suggests that while behavioral management is possible, teaching offenders to resist acting on their impulses, the underlying attractions themselves often prove resistant to fundamental change. Edward might learn to control his behavior, but whether he could ever truly reform his psychological orientation remained doubtful. The institution of trust itself suffered damage from Edward's crimes. Every profession that requires public faith, medicine, law, education, death care, relies on assumptions that professionals will honor their ethical obligations even in situations lacking external monitoring. Edward's predation demonstrated that these assumptions, while generally valid, can catastrophically fail when confronted with calculating predators. Rebuilding that trust required more than assurances and reforms. It required time, transparent accountability, and demonstrated commitment to preventing future similar betrayals. For the deceased individuals Edward violated, justice came in incomplete forms. Their families gained acknowledgement of the wrongs committed. Their violator faced punishment and public condemnation. Institutional reforms might prevent similar future violations, but the violations themselves could never be undone. The indignity they suffered was permanent, their final vulnerability exploited by someone entrusted with their care. This irreparable harm represents perhaps the most tragic dimension of Edward's crimes: the complete impossibility of adequate remediation or restoration. The case of Christopher Joseph Edward stands as a dark testament to human capacity for depravity even within institutions designed for dignity and respect. It demonstrates that evil wears many faces, including professional uniforms and institutional credentials. It reveals that our most vulnerable moments, including death itself, can attract predators who view vulnerability as opportunity. And it reminds us that vigilance, oversight, and accountability cannot be sacrificed to convenience, cost savings, or uncomfortable discomfort with confronting dark possibilities. In the mortuary coolers of Adelaide, where Edward committed his crimes, new systems and protocols now govern operations. Surveillance monitors spaces previously private. Dual technician requirements ensure constant oversight. Enhanced background checks scrutinize those granted access. These changes represent lessons purchased at terrible price: the dignity of dozens or hundreds of deceased individuals, the traumatized trust of their families, and the shaken faith of a community forced to confront nightmares lurking behind sterile institutional walls. The story ends not with redemption or restoration. Such outcomes were never possible given the nature of the crimes, but with hard-won accountability and the grim determination to prevent such betrayals from occurring again. The deceased whom Edward violated remain violated. Their families remain traumatized, but his exposure, prosecution, and imprisonment stand as testament that even crimes committed against the defenseless, even violations hidden behind professional respectability, can face justice when society refuses to look away from uncomfortable truths. Christopher Joseph Edward's name now joins the grim catalog of those who betrayed sacred trust for predatory purposes. His case serves as cautionary tale, warning of the darkness that can flourish when institutions prioritize convenience over vigilance, when professional certification substitutes for genuine oversight, and when society's reluctance to imagine the unimaginable creates spaces where monsters operate undetected. The victims of his crimes deserve remembrance not merely for their suffering, but as reminders of why vigilance matters, why accountability cannot be optional, and why protecting the vulnerable, even in death, requires eternal commitment. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.